Her Alpha CEO, by Charlene Dixon. A romancely.com story.
Chapter 1. Nina Jacobs watched the man surreptitiously from behind the cash register. He'd been lurking in the psychology section for almost 15 minutes, long enough to make her wonder whether he was looking for something or hiding from someone. She'd considered going over to offer him some help, but there was something about his smart business suit and the look of supreme confidence he'd worn when he entered the store that stopped her. In her experience, men like that didn't take kindly to offers of help from store clerks. "Would you like me to wrap that for you, ma'am?" Nina turned her attention back to a customer, efficiently wrapping up the children's books she'd helped her choose for her nephew's 3rd birthday. "Have a lovely day. Bye." As the woman left the shop, Nina sighed. The man was still standing in the psychology section, but his look of assurance had been replaced by an expression of perplexity, akin to a child who'd lost his parents in the park. Taking a breath, Nina tossed her braids over her shoulder, the colorful beads clicking as they smacked against each other. She entered the row where he stood, pasted a smile on her face, and walked up to him with a confidence she didn't quite feel. "May I help you find something, sir?" She fought the urge to giggle as he turned to her with an almost comical expression of relief. "Yes, please." His eyes flicked to her name badge. "Nina." He met her eyes and Nina caught her breath. His were a deep cobalt blue, lit with wry amusement as he shoved a hand through his already messy hair. The ash-blonde curls would have looked ridiculous atop his head, were it not for his aquiline nose and strong jaw, lined with a faint afternoon stubble. The man was ridiculously gorgeous. He was also still talking, Nina realized as he gestured to the shelf of books in front of him. "I'm sorry, you said you were trying to choose a book from the psychology section as a birthday present? For a woman." Brian felt a flush creeping up his neck as Nina stared at him in obvious disdain. He hastened to correct her obvious mistaken impression. "Yes, for my sister, Jennifer. She's a psychologist. It's her birthday party this evening, and as per usual, I've left it to the last minute to get her gift. She mentioned something about a series of books she'd like for her practice, but I can't for the life of me remember what they were. I just assumed it was something to do with her work." "Oh!" Nina's face lit up and Brian caught himself staring. Her skin was smooth and dark, like rich ebony wood, and although her bookstore uniform was plain and functional, it fit her well, showing off her generous curves in just the right places. Her long braids were tied with brightly colored beads and shells, and he curled his fingers into his palms to resist reaching out to touch them. She reminded him of someone, but he couldn't think who. He watched the animated expressions chase themselves across her face as she spoke, revealing a surprising depth of knowledge about psychology and the authors that contributed to the section. Finally, when he had paid for the collection of classics bound in soft leather embossed in gold, and she was wrapping it for him, Brian made the decision to ask her the question he'd been contemplating since she'd first started discussing the merits of various psychological studies. "Nina, I really appreciate your help in choosing this for Jenny. I'm sure she's going to love the gift." Nina's smile widened and she looked down shyly. "It's a pleasure, sir. Please call me Brian. Sir makes me feel so old." He grinned at her and swore that she was blushing, though her skin hid the telltale signs. She handed him the package over the counter, refusing to meet his gaze. "Here you go, Brian. I hope you have fun at the party tonight." Nina smiled shyly, already turning her attention to the customers waiting behind him. He stopped her with a hand on her wrist. "Come with me." "Excuse me?" She looked up at him in shock, her deep brown eyes widening with momentary fright. "Tonight, to my sister's party. Come with me. It'll be fun." His eyes shone as he smiled at her. Beneath his fingers, he felt her pulse speed up. "Say yes, Nina." She hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the customers behind him. "I'm not leaving until you agree." Brian let go of her and stood against the counter, calmly prepared to wait until she accepted his invitation. "Do you always get your own way?" Nina's eyebrow quirked as she crossed her arms, glaring at him. His smug expression should have annoyed her. Instead, she struggled to control the laugh that bubbled in her chest as he replied, "Of course." She rolled her eyes, secretly relishing his attention, though she was aware of the other customers shifting impatiently as they waited for him to leave. "Okay, fine. I'll come tonight. What's the address?" She handed him a piece of paper and he jotted it down, reading the untidy scrawl out loud to make sure she could read his writing. "I'll see you tonight, Nina. 7:30. He waved, heading out the door with an arrogant swagger that made her lips twitch. It was only when she'd served the last customer that she realized he'd left his sister's gift on the counter. Her eyes narrowed. The sneaky son of a... She was sure he'd done it on purpose, but she was stuck now. She had his address, but not his number. She'd have to go tonight, if only to make sure his sister got her carefully chosen birthday gift. As Nina hid the package behind the counter, she couldn't help the secret thrill that raced through her. She would never admit it, but she was looking forward to seeing Brian again that evening. Nina pulled her car into the driveway, parking behind the long line of high-class sports models and German-manufactured vehicles. She peered out the windscreen at the house, which loomed over her, lit from top to bottom and emanating an aura of casual disregard for the extravagance. Aware that her jaw had dropped open, she snapped it shut, looking down at her simple outfit, which suddenly felt out of place. She pulled the slip of paper out of her purse, double-checking the address. 1309 La Rue Avenue. Definitely the right place. With a shrug, she grabbed the gift-wrapped parcel off the passenger seat and climbed out, slamming the door of her old Ford behind her. Music was echoing from the open windows, the strains of classical instruments beautifully recorded. Nina was particularly fond of classical music, but she didn't recognize the orchestra from the music that was playing and made a mental note to ask Brian when she found him. She often downloaded music to play in the background of the bookstore or at home. Her musical preferences ranged from classical to heavy metal and hip-hop, depending on her mood. Favorites for the shop were soundtracks from movies and games. She strolled up the cobbled driveway, smiling vaguely at the odd guests who had stepped outside to take a call or have a smoke. With every step towards the large double doors, she felt her insecurity growing. She wasn't an expert in designer clothing, but there was no doubt in her mind that everyone she'd met so far was dressed to the nines in the most expensive couture they could afford. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the doorway and immediately choked on the air in her lungs. The doors opened onto an immaculate, marble-tiled foyer, facing a grand, sweeping staircase leading to the second floor. The foyer's pressed ceiling seemed miles away, but the space was filled by an impressive crystal chandelier that glittered with hundreds of sparkling lights. The milling crowd, whose sparkling jewels and crystal champagne glasses caught the light, didn't seem to notice her entrance, and Nina was strongly tempted to drop Jennifer's gift on the end table and make a run for it. Brian hadn't mentioned that the party was formal, and although she dressed in a brightly printed floor-length dress, most of the women were in chic evening dresses that sparkled and shone with diamante that Nina suspected were not glass or plastic. "Nina, you came." Brian strode through the crowd towards her, his open-necked suit from earlier replaced by a black tie tuxedo which fit his broad shoulders and reminded Nina of a blonde-haired Bruce Wayne. She wondered fleetingly if he was as wealthy as the billionaire playboy of Batman legends. Brian reached her side and Nina held out the gift-wrapped books to him. "I had to come. You left this behind." For a moment, he looked surprised at her tone. Then his smile was back as he took it from her. "You could have used my credit card details to get my address and have it sent to me." He held out his arm for her to take. In a daze, cursing her lack of forethought, Nina took it and followed as he led the way through the foyer and into a ballroom where the music swelled and made talking without shouting nearly impossible. Brian led her skillfully through the dancers and guests who were lingering at the fringes of the room, people smiling and nodding at him, throwing curious glances at Nina, who pasted a smile on her face and tried to pretend she belonged in this glittering crowd. As the crowd parted to let them through, Nina came to a halt, staring in fascination at the live quartet of string musicians set up on a platform at the end of the room. "There's a live orchestra?" She spoke loudly enough for Brian to hear her over the music. But at that moment the song ended as the orchestra stopped for a break and her words, filled with awe, echoed through the room. Nina winced as people turned to look at her, but Brian just chuckled and tugged on her elbow. "Come on. Let me introduce you to the birthday girl." He led her over to a group of 3 people standing together near the open French doors that led to the terrace outside. "Jenny, your gift has finally arrived. Nina was kind enough to bring it with her." Brian winked down at her as a beautiful blonde woman in a shimmering teal dress turned to them with a smile. The couple she'd been talking to excused themselves, leaving Nina alone with Brian and his sister. Jenny was tall and slim, and for a moment Nina felt self-conscious next to the blonde siblings. She wasn't given time to feel that way for long as Jenny threw her arms around her and hugged her as though she was a long-lost sister. "Nina, how wonderful to meet you." Brian's spoken of no one else all afternoon. "I couldn't wait to meet the woman who managed to get my brother away from his computer games." Jenny pulled back and grinned as Nina looked up at Brian, who appeared uncomfortably flushed. He shoved the gift at his sister. "Here, open your gift. Nina helped me choose it. Saved my life, in fact." He smiled at her and Nina rolled her eyes. "I was just doing my job." She caught Jenny's puzzled expression. "I work at the store." Brian already knew what you wanted. He just needed some help choosing the right one. "I hope I guessed right." Nina smiled at Jenny's eager expression as she ripped into the wrapping paper, revealing the books within. Jenny's squeal turned heads as she saw the books in their case. "It's perfect. Thank you so much." She put the box down on the table nearby and then hugged Brian and Nina again. "I'm so glad you were there to help my brother with his choice." "Nina, last year I got a box set of Star Wars movies. I hate Star Wars." She faked a shudder even as Brian frowned. "You told me you loved the movies." "That was only because I was dating Jamie at the time and he was a fan." Jenny rolled her eyes at Nina. "Honestly, Nina, are you sure you know what you're getting involved with here? Brian is the biggest geek ever." "Oh no." Nina's eyes widened in horror. "There's nothing between me and your brother." "I see." Jenny looked awkward for a moment, then shrugged it off with a smile. "Well, I'm thrilled with the gift, so thank you for helping him choose it." "It's no problem, really. And happy birthday." Nina suddenly remembered her own gift for Jenny, reaching into her purse and pulling out an envelope. "It's just a little something." She handed it to Jenny, whose excitement at the gift card for the bookstore made her smile, even as the woman hugged her again. Nina thought she'd been hugged more in the last 10 minutes than she ever had in her life. Somehow, it didn't bother her as much as it usually did. Jenny was sweet and bubbly, and best of all, she seemed to genuinely like Nina, chatting to her while Brian watched the 2 women with a smug expression on his face. Nina was supremely conscious of his presence at her side, but tried to ignore it as she spoke to Jenny about her favorite psychology authors, realizing they shared a common interest in feminist women who worked in the field. By the time the orchestra returned from their break and the music made talking impossible, Nina felt as though she'd known Brian and Jenny for most of her life. Jenny excused herself to go mingle with her guests, and Brian turned to Nina with a mischievous grin. He leaned down to speak close to her ear, and Nina's stomach flip-flopped as the clean, woodsy smell of his aftershave filled her senses. "Want to dance?" She nodded eagerly. She loved dancing and had never had the opportunity to dance to a live orchestra at a private party before. Brian's strong hand wrapped around hers, and he led her onto the dance floor, pulling her into his arms as the orchestra began a fast rumba. Nina grinned up at him, her eyes shining as he led her round the floor in the sensual moves. They fit together as though they'd been dance partners for years, but Nina's skin tingled at every point of contact, and Brian's intense expression suggested that he was not as immune to the chemistry between them as she'd thought. When the music stopped, they stood close to each other, chests rising and falling with each quick breath as they stared at each other. The applause of the crowd around them broke their focus, and Nina giggled self-consciously. The other guests stood around the ballroom, having cleared the floor to watch them dance together, and now they began to make their way back for the waltz. Instead of joining them, Brian gestured to the doors, and when Nina nodded, he wrapped an arm round her shoulders. Together they walked outside into the cool night air. The terrace was tiled, with steps down into the gardens, which twinkled with fairy lights threaded through the trees and shrubs. "This place is beautiful," Nina sighed as she looked around. "Thank you." She looked up at Brian in surprise. "This is your house?" Yes, I bought it 3 years ago. He let her go as she stepped back from him, suspicion on her face. What exactly do you do for a living, Brian? I'm CEO of a gaming production company. Her suspicion growing, Nina motioned for him to elaborate. My father was Tom Guidice, of Guidice Games. I own and run the company now. Holy shit. Nina's hands flew up to cover her mouth as she swore. Brian laughed, stepping forward to pull her hands away from her face, threading his fingers through hers. Shocked, she didn't resist. You're Brian Guidice? The Brian Guidice? Billionaire CEO of the best game design company in America? That Brian Guidice. He suddenly looked uncomfortable, shrugging wryly. I prefer just being Brian, but yes, I'm that Brian Guidice. Man, if I had known I was coming here tonight, I would have brought my copy of Ark's Roses for you to autograph. Nina huffed irritably and Brian looked down at her in surprise. You're a gamer? Not as much as I used to be. I used to game with my sister. Nina bit her lip. We don't really speak anymore. Brian nodded, but didn't pry, and Nina was inexplicably grateful for his understanding. Deciding to change the subject, she turned to look into the ballroom, where the glittering assemblage was still mingling. You could have warned me that I needed to dress up. If I'd known I'd be coming to a party full of billionaire players, I would have worn something more appropriate than this old dress. You look beautiful. Brian's voice was husky. Nina felt his hand tugging gently and turned to face him. She looked up at him, admiring his long, dark lashes in contrast with his light hair. Her head swam as they stared at each other, getting lost in the depths of their eyes. Nina bit her lip, watching as Brian's gaze was drawn to the motion, his pupils dilating. Her breath caught. He's going to kiss me, she thought. Then, I'm going to let him, as her eyelids fluttered closed, and she lifted her lips to meet his.
Oh no, it's about to get hot.
But we can't put this on YouTube as they don't allow it.
I'm sorry.
But check the description of this video to join Romancely Audio Velvet and get the steamy scenes in future.
If you're already a member, the love scene references, her Alpha CEO, Chapter 1, Love Scene 1.
Okay, back to the story. Brian, stop. We can't. I can't. She pushed against his shoulders and Brian stepped back immediately. I'm sorry, Nina. I didn't mean to get so carried away. He reached out to cup her face, running his thumb over her swollen lips. Nina turned her face into his hand, unable to stop herself planting a kiss on his palm. She reached up to take his hand. Walk me to my car? You don't have to go. I think we both know I do. Before this gets way beyond what either of us is ready for. Brian looked down at her, his expression inscrutable. You're not like other women, are you, Nina Jacobs? I sincerely hope not, Brian Guidice. She smirked at him and he laughed out loud, delighted with her honesty. I'd like to see you again, if you don't mind. Really? Why? Nina frowned at him, puzzled by his apparent interest. I like you, Nina. You're a breath of fresh air in a world full of pretentious fools who think that because I have money, I'm an easy meal ticket. Damn. There go my plans to get a fancy dinner at a 5-star restaurant out of you. Nina teased him gently and Brian laughed again. She decided that she liked seeing him laugh and that she wanted to tease him more often. I'm free next Saturday. Why don't you come round to my place? I'll make dinner. It was Brian's turn to look puzzled. Don't you want to go out for a meal? Brian, I'm a simple girl at heart. Besides, I've already seen your house, which is stunning, by the way. It seems only fair that you come round to my place. Nina didn't add that she wanted him to see her house, to recognize that although comfortable, she would never have the kind of wealth he did, would never be able to mingle with the sort of people he considered friends, because she simply didn't have the same level of wealth and worldly experience. Her mama had always said that money didn't buy class, but Nina knew without a doubt that the people that Brian and his family were used to associating with would soon mean he'd lose interest in her. As he walked her to her car and promised to be in touch, Nina couldn't help the slight pang of disappointment at the knowledge that her romance with Brian Guidice would be over before it even properly began. If you want more BWWM romances like this, please, my love, Be sure to subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel. I look forward to spending more time with you. Subscribe and let's make it happen.
Chapter 2. Nina spent the week in a state of excitement mingled with panic. The days couldn't go by fast enough for her liking, but at the same time, they were speeding past. Work provided a welcome distraction as she helped customers choose books and kept the shelves well stocked and tidy. She had several books on her to-read list, but none of them managed to hold her attention for very long as she kept drifting off into daydreams about a certain gaming CEO. On Wednesday morning, she stood in front of her mirror, giving herself a stern lecture. "Get a grip, Nina Jacobs. Your mama would be ashamed of you, mooning around over a man you barely know." She grinned at the photo of her mother, staring at her from the top right corner of the mirror. "Your mama would also tell you what a fine man you'd caught." Her smile faded, and she pressed a kiss to her fingertips before touching the photo. "I miss you, Mama. I wish you were here." Shaking off her melancholy, Nina dressed for the day and hurried out of the house. She waved good morning to Mrs. Beachley, then climbed into her car. "Nosy old busybody." She muttered the words to herself through a clenched smile as she drove past the woman who was pottering in her garden. Nina had lived next door to the woman for the last 4 years and had first-hand experience with her interfering nature. For a brief moment, she wondered if inviting Brian around to her place was a good idea. Mrs. Beachley was a gossip of note, couldn't keep anything to herself, and loved nothing more than judging other people for the way they chose to live. Nina shook her head. She was a grown woman, and who she chose to invite round to her place for dinner was her business. So what if it was a white, billionaire CEO of a multi-award-winning gaming franchise? Her laugh may have been just a touch hysterical. Brian paused the game on his console, running a hand over his face, wincing as it caught on his 2-day-old beard. He'd been trialing Guidice's new game, which was due for release in a couple months. He blinked, stretching and yawning. His eyes felt scratchy, and his lazy boy armchair held the shape of his 6'4" frame as though it had been molded for him. He checked his smart watch. 32 emails, and close to 100 texts. He needed a shower, and then he'd deal with the correspondence before he crashed. Soaping himself under the spray, his mind wandered to Jenny's party. He replayed the evening in his mind, from the time of Nina's arrival to their kiss on the terrace. He'd barely been able to stop thinking about her since. It was now early Wednesday morning, and a trial run of the game he'd helped design, which should have taken him a day or two at the most, had taken twice as long because he was constantly distracted by the feel of Nina's lips against his. He'd have to speak to the developers. He died way too often, the game should have forced a restart. Guidice Games prided themselves on developing games that challenged hardcore gamers. A game that didn't force a restart after a certain number of deaths went against their design principles. A grin spread across his face. He'd have to remember to thank Nina for her help. If she hadn't been such a distraction, he may not have discovered the flaw in the game. He was whistling as he toweled himself off and wandered back into his man cave, the towel wrapped around his hips. He switched on his business computer, logging into his email provider. He scanned the emails which his assistant had marked as needing his personal attention, sending off a few quick responses where needed, and forwarding others to relevant employees, requesting information from them. Brian had always prided himself on his personal attention to a business which employed over 200 staff. He knew every employee by name, interviewed every new intern himself, and kept his finger firmly on the pulse of the company. It was the least he could do to live up to his father's expectations. He'd hoped that his brother, Tristan, would remain with the company to help share the load, but sibling rivalry had proved their undoing, and when Dad had appointed him CEO over Tristan, his brother had left to start his own company. Things had not ended well, and Brian felt the added guilt of having let his brother down, all of which drove him to work ridiculous hours. Unfortunately, as his sister so often reminded him, it left very little time for him to have a social life. Dating was out of the question. No woman would put up with his schedule for very long, and he hadn't found a woman he'd consider giving priority to above work. His emails dealt with, he scanned through the texts he'd received while he'd been offline. Everyone with his personal number knew that he would often be incommunicado for days while he trialed the games he and his staff designed. Finally finished with business, he shut down his computer, tossed his towel onto the floor and slipped into bed naked. His last thought as sleep claimed him was that Saturday night's dinner date with Nina was only 4 days away. Saturday dawned, bright and sunny, and in complete contrast to Nina's mood. If she was honest with herself, it was just her nerves making her tense, but it was easier to pretend she was out of sorts because she hadn't heard anything from Brian all week and was beginning to doubt he would show up. Nevertheless, she went to the market early, choosing the freshest chicken and greens to take back with her. She was going to make her best soul food for Brian, fried chicken and collard greens. She spent the day cleaning the house, not an unusual pastime for a Saturday, except that chores that would normally have been completed in an hour took her the whole morning as she shifted furniture and scrutinized every nook and cranny. Try as she might, the shabby comfort of her little home did not, and would never compare to the opulence of Brian's mansion. Finally, at about noon, Nina collapsed onto the couch in her living room. A huff of exasperation escaped her as she looked around the sunlit room. She had never been bothered by what other people thought of her before. What made this man so different? Absolutely nothing. Her chin lifted with determination as she reached for the TV remote. Switching it on, she promised to lose herself in her favorite shows for the next few hours and not think about a certain billionaire gamer. When her cell phone rang a couple hours later, she leapt to answer it, fumbling for the volume button on the remote. Hello? Nina? Hi, it's Brian. Hi, Brian. How are you? I'm great, Nina. I'm sorry for only getting in touch now, but it's been a bit crazy at work this week. That's okay. Are you canceling our dinner? What? No. He sounded genuinely horrified at the thought, and Nina felt warmth creep through her. I just called to find out what I can bring to drink with the meal. Oh, well. White wine, I guess. Nina found herself shrugging at the empty room. What did one usually drink with fried chicken and collards? Great. I'll see you soon. And Nina? Yes? You're not getting rid of me that easily. He cut the call, leaving Nina standing in the middle of the lounge feeling as though a tornado had just swept through and deposited her in Oz. She stared into space for a long moment, 1,000,001 thoughts swirling through her mind as she replayed Brian's last sentence. It's creepy, right? A bit stalkerish? She bit her lip and walked through to the kitchen, still talking to herself. Either that, or he thinks it's romantic. Jenny did say he was a massive geek. Pots banged as she pulled them out of the cupboard and slammed them onto the counter. A drop-dead gorgeous, pathetically wealthy geek who brings wine to a homemade meal. The greens were rapidly chopped up and thrown into the pot, along with onions and vegetable stock. Nina Jacobs, if your mother could hear you talking to yourself about a man while you cooked him a meal. She'd be so proud. Her sense of humor taking over, Nina laughed and vowed, for the second time that day, to stop worrying about what Brian Guidice thought of her. When Brian rang the doorbell promptly at 7 o'clock, Nina was ready for him. Wow, something smells amazing. He stepped into her house with a grin, and Nina couldn't help smiling up at him in response. Thank you. Welcome. Come on through to the kitchen. I'm just putting the finishing touches on the dessert. Are we starting with dessert? He looked so hopeful, Nina laughed. Didn't your mother teach you that you don't get dessert without eating all your dinner? She tried, but she failed to take into account the extreme nature of my sweet tooth. Particularly, he waggled his eyebrows and leered at her, where chocolate is involved. She rolled her eyes and led the way through to the kitchen. Really? That's the best you can come up with? Cut me some slack. I'm distracted by the smell of food and the sight of the most beautiful woman in the room. I'm the only woman in the room. Well, that's exactly my point. He winked at her, then glanced around her kitchen and walked unerringly over to her cutlery drawer. Pulling out the corkscrew, he turned to lean against the counter while he opened the bottle of wine he'd brought with him. Glasses? Nina frowned at him suspiciously. How did you know where I kept the corkscrew? Brian appeared puzzled for a moment, then laughed. You only have a single section of drawers in your cupboards. It seemed like the logical place to store it. Ah, of course. Logic. She rolled her eyes again, pointing at the glass-fronted cabinet behind him. In that case, logic dictates that the glasses are behind you, since you clearly can't see them. Brian didn't appear at all embarrassed as he peered over his shoulder into the cabinet. Would you look at that? Glasses. He placed the wine bottle on the counter and reached into the cupboard, pouring them both a glass while Nina finished slicing strawberries and placing them around the chocolate cake. He placed the glass near her and tried to steal a strawberry. Nina slapped his hand and he snatched it back. Is that any way to treat a guest? When the guest is trying to spoil his dinner by stealing dessert first, yes. Hands off, mister. Brian backed away, laughing. Okay. I'll behave. With an increasingly warm feeling in the center of her belly, Nina issued instructions to Brian, who helped with setting the small table in the dining room and then carried the plates of food through. When they were both seated, he looked at the spread in front of them in awe. This looks amazing, Nina. I can't believe you cooked all this. Nina smiled with pleasure, taking his plate to dish up for him. I've always loved cooking, but living alone makes a girl lazy. It's nice to have someone to cook for a change. She handed him his plate and he nodded his thanks. If this is how you always cook, I'll come eat here every night. Nina paused for a moment, spooning collards onto her plate. Brian, who was waiting for her to start, noticed the hesitation, but decided to ignore it. They ate in silence for a moment, only the delighted mumbles of Brian's appreciation filling the room. Once their initial hunger had been satiated, conversation resumed, with both Nina and Brian sharing stories of their week at work, laughing as they discovered their common dislike of instant messaging and social media. The wine flowed quickly, topped up by Brian throughout the meal, and the conversation swung between light-hearted teasing and deeper flirting that left Nina feeling as though she drank far too much. When he held up the bottle with the last few drops in it, Nina shook her head. No, thank you. I can't believe I've drunk so much. I don't usually like wine. Now she tells me. Brian rolled his eyes towards the ceiling, placing the bottle back on the table. What was I supposed to do? Tell you not to bring wine because I don't like it that much? Yes, actually. Nina pushed back from the table, a sudden burst of temper sparking in her eyes. Brian was on his feet in front of her. She poked him the chest, each point punctuated by her stabbing finger. I'm sorry I was raised with a few more manners than that, Mr. Guidice, but if you don't like it. I do. He cut her off, his hand grabbing hers as she reached to prod him again. I like it very much. His voice was low, filled with a subtle message that drew Nina's gaze to his like a magnet. Brian. Nina, his voice teased her and she swayed forward, her eyes flicking to his lips in unconscious need. With a tug she felt in slow motion, Brian pulled her into his arms and bent to capture her lips with his. He kissed her lightly, teasingly, waiting for permission to deepen the embrace. She gave it to him, stepping closer and wrapping her arms around his back, her mouth opening under his. With a soft growl of satisfaction, he tightened his grasp, his tongue slipping over her lips and into the warm recesses of her mouth. Time seemed to stand still as they kissed, Brian's hand playing with the braids that tumbled down her back, sending goosebumps along her skin. Nina shivered in his arms, and Brian broke the kiss to look down at her in concern. "Are you cold?" Her eyes fluttered open, blinking at him in bewilderment, before a frown creased the space between her eyebrows. "Do I look cold to you?" The tart sarcasm in her tone made Brian chuckle as he shook his head. "No, sweetheart. You definitely look hotter than you have any right to." "Oh, spare me the sexy talk, Brian. I don't need the act when I'm already about to fall straight into your bed." It was his turn to look angry, as he stepped back from her, his back stiff with indignation. "I don't know what sort of person you think I am, Nina, but if you think that of me, then I owe you an apology. I didn't mean to give you the wrong impression. Thank you for dinner. I'll see myself out." He was walking to the door when her voice stopped him. "Brian, wait. I'm sorry. That was uncalled for, you're right. It's just, you completely throw me off guard every time we meet." Nina's voice was muffled. Brian turned to see her with her face in her hands. "If it's any consolation, Nina, you have the same effect on me. I don't want you to get the wrong idea about me. I don't do things like this very often. At all, in fact. You're the first."
Hi there. Unfortunately, we've had to take this steamy scene out as it's against YouTube's terms of service.
If you don't want to miss out on love scenes in future stories, check the description and join Romancely Audio Velvet. If you're already a member, the love scene references Her Alpha CEO, Chapter 2, Love Scene 2.
Okay, back to the story.
Spent, he collapsed into her embrace.
Chapter 3. Brian left Nina the next day, waving cheerfully at Mrs. Beachley, who was peering over the fence at him. He whistled as he drove back home, a smile on his face as he remembered the night before. Nina was incredible, and he hasn't been able to get enough of her. They'd made love 3 times the previous night, each time more tender than the last, until they'd fallen asleep wrapped in each other's arms in the early hours of the morning. Brian had needed to leave early to head to the office, and Nina had still been half asleep when she'd kissed him goodbye and let him out of the house. He tried to sneak out of bed without waking her, but they'd been too closely entwined and she'd woken with a sleepy, satiated smile on her kiss-swollen lips. Her sleepy protest at his leaving the bed had him reluctant to leave, but unfortunately duty called and he was unable to oblige her mumbled request to return to her arms. Instead, he'd showered and helped himself to coffee in her kitchen, the smell of which roused her. They drank a cup together, and then he'd thoroughly kissed her before leaving. She'd groaned when she'd spotted her neighbor, but Brian had simply chuckled. He didn't really care what the woman thought about seeing him leave Nina's home so early in the morning. Arriving at home, he quickly changed into a fresh set of clothes and grabbed some fruit salad from the fridge. His housekeeper made sure to keep the kitchen well stocked with healthy food, a comfort Brian enjoyed. He chose not to mention the cupboard stashed full of sweets and chocolate at his office. Mrs. Morgan was a harridan who'd spent most of her life trying to instill healthy eating habits in the Guidice children. For the most part, she'd succeeded, but when testing a new game, Brian had discovered there was nothing quite like a sugar rush to keep him awake. He arrived at the office to discover several urgent messages from his sister. Plugging his cell phone in to charge, the battery had died the previous night. He switched it on. It came to life with a flurry of beeps which told him his sister had been trying to get hold of him for a while. He picked up the phone and dialed her number. "Hello? Brian." She answered almost immediately. "Hey, what's up? Where have you been? I've been trying to get a hold of you for hours." Yeah, sorry about that. My battery died. Look, it's about Tristan." "What about him?" He called me yesterday. Okay, and? You guys are allowed to talk, you know. Just 'cause our brother hates my guts doesn't mean you guys can't still be friends. Realizing what he sounded like, Brian winced. Sorry, I didn't mean it that way. He heard Jenny sigh. It's okay, I get it. But you know we've never been as close as you and I are. There was silence for a moment as they recalled the enmity between Tristan and themselves. Their brother had always struggled with the feeling of being left out, the rejected black sheep of the family. Jenny blamed their father for encouraging the brothers to compete with each other. But Brian had always argued that Dad had treated them the same way. Tristan was just a sore loser. He'd wanted control of Guidice games, and when he didn't get it, he'd lost his temper and sworn to get revenge on his brother. Jen had been trying to bridge the gap between the two men ever since. Okay, so what about our beloved brother? Brian pulled himself back to the present moment. His company has just announced the release of their new game. It's got everything you planned for New Moon Rising and more. Brian sat up straight, a cold chill running down his spine. What? I don't know how he got the intel on your game, Brian, but their game is almost identical with a few added features. And the release date is 2 days before yours. Jen, please tell me this is a bad joke? Silence answered him and Brian sighed, running a frustrated hand through his hair. Okay, it's okay. Dad always warned me about corporate espionage. I thought it was a joke. Or at least, that my own brother wouldn't do something like that to me. I'm sorry. Jen's voice was soft, hesitant. It's okay, Jen. It's not your fault. Thanks for the heads up. I'll get to work on it straight away. He hung up the phone and sat for a moment wondering what he should do. He knew Tristan had called Jen to brag about the game. It's exactly what he'd done when he first developed the storyline and concept. For a moment, he wondered whether it was a coincidence, just a strange twist of fate that had resulted in two brothers from rival companies developing the same concept for the game. Brian laughed at his folly. It may be coincidence, but it was unlikely that it was. Tristan had a spy in Guidice games, and it was only a matter of time before he outstripped his brother in the competitive industry by using his insider knowledge. That's a low blow, Tristan. A very low blow. Brian muttered to himself, turning to his computer and switching it on to begin implementing his plan to outsmart the competition. He'd developed it years ago and hadn't shared it with anyone, not even his sister, but he'd never thought he'd have to use it against his brother. Within moments, he was immersed in his work, all thoughts of life outside Guidice games forgotten. Nina said goodbye to Brian, wincing at the expression on Mrs. Beachley's face, and then wandered back into the house. It was the third Saturday of the month, and that meant she was off work for the whole weekend. She sighed blissfully and stretched, feeling her body aching in places she'd forgotten she had. Brian had thoroughly worn her out, and she contemplated crawling back into bed with a book, but now that she was awake, she was buzzing with energy. She made her way into the kitchen and started the dishwasher before loading the rest of the pots and pans into the sink. Nina hummed while she washed the dishes. The sight of the empty wine bottle still on the table where they'd left it made her smile. She rinsed it out and put it into the cupboard where she hoarded her crafting supplies. She would turn that bottle into a candle holder. Call her sentimental, but her night with Brian, which she sincerely hoped would turn into more than just one night, was one she wanted to remember. She wasn't sure how long it would take for him to contact her, but she wasn't going to be one of those females who lay around waiting for men to contact them after a night together. Still, Nina couldn't help checking her phone on her way to the bathroom. Seeing no messages from Brian, she snorted, threw her phone on the bed and went to shower. After a long time under the hot spray, she climbed out and dressed. She would take herself out for lunch, she decided, and then see if any of her friends were free to join her for a movie later that evening. There was a new superhero film out that would make a good distraction from thoughts of a man who was sexier than men had any right to be. She picked up her phone and the latest fantasy novel she was busy reading and grabbed her purse on the way out of the house. "Oh, Nina, dear," Mrs. Beachley called as soon as she stepped outside. "Good morning, Mrs. Beachley," Nine replied, trying to keep walking towards her car before the woman could start talking to her. Many a time, Nina had been late for gatherings with friends because Mrs. Beachley had stopped her for a quick chat. Who was that handsome young man who left here this morning, Nina? A new boyfriend? You want to be careful with men like that, my dear. They know they're good-looking and they use it to take advantage of young women like yourself. Your mother asked me to look after you before she passed. Bless her soul. And I promised I'd take care of you as if you were my own daughter. She paused for breath and Nina jumped into the conversation. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Beachley. Brian's just a friend. I have to go now or I'll be late. Goodbye. With a huff of relief, Nina slipped into the driver's seat of her car and slammed the door. Mrs. Beachley had rounded the fence that divided their properties and was standing next to the car with her hands on her hips, clearly waiting for Nina to lower her window so she could continue her lecture. With a silent apology to her mother for her rudeness, Nina smiled, waved and reversed out of her driveway as quickly as she could without risking injury to her neighbor. Not that she didn't daydream about sometimes running the gossipy old bat down, but she knew the woman meant no harm and was really just lonely. Still, she was far too forward for Nina's liking, and the last thing she wanted was for Mrs. Beachley to begin blabbing to the whole street about the young man she'd seen visiting Nina. Nina cringed as she drove down the street, imagining the gossip that would follow once Mrs. Beachley found out that Brian was the CEO of Guidice Games, and a billionaire to boot. She tried to remember what he'd been driving, but last night she'd been too nervous to notice, and this morning, too drowsy and distracted by his kisses. Shrugging her shoulders, Nina resolved not to worry about Mrs. Beachley or Brian Guidice for the rest of the day. She turned on her indicator and swung left into the Saturday morning traffic of shoppers and sightseers, heading towards her favorite coffee shop and art gallery. Turning on the radio, she settled into her seat and began singing along to the CD of musicals she kept in the car. It was only when his stomach began to rumble audibly that Brian pushed away from his desk and rubbed his eyes. Checking the time, he was startled to discover it was already after 3 in the afternoon. He'd been revising marketing plans for New Moon Rising and had gotten hold of his development team, calling them in for an emergency meeting the following day. None of them had grumbled about it being a Sunday. Guidice Games paid their employees exceptionally well, and everyone would be more than adequately compensated for working over a weekend. In addition to that, Brian made it a priority to hire men and women who were equally as passionate about game development as he was. Each of the team members were emotionally invested in the game being a success, except one. He frowned as he remembered the reason for the meeting and the fact that one of the team had to be a spy for his brother. When his belly rumbled again, making it clear that food was necessary, he rolled his tight shoulders and decided he'd contemplate it over a meal. The thought of satisfying his appetite made him think of Nina, and he reached for his phone, sure that he'd probably have a message from her. He kept his phone on silent while he worked, not wanting to be disturbed, but even though there were several messages from colleagues and Jen, there was nothing from Nina. Brian frowned at the screen, wondering briefly if she was okay, before deciding that she was probably working. She'd mumbled something about work when he'd woken her this morning. That must be it, he thought, thumbing the keypad to pull up the number of his favorite takeaway. Placing his order for a double cheeseburger, he went back to contemplating his plans for the release of the game. Jen had said that Tristan had planned the release for 2 days before their game was set to release, which was fine, if they were ready for it. Game developers often released games early and then waited for gamers to play them and find the bugs before they released patches on them. It was a way to test the game on the market before investing any extra expenditure on the development. Guidice Games had set themselves apart by releasing fully operational games, with only updates to the gaming experience being released after the original. In addition to that, while most gaming companies, including Tristan's, sold their games online as downloads and required an internet connection to play, Brian had insisted that Guidice Games remain offline as much as possible. He remembered his friend from school, Paul Barden, who had attended their prestigious private school on a scholarship. Paul hadn't had an internet connection at home, and although he loved gaming, he'd missed out on the opportunity to play the same games the rest of the boys played, simply because he didn't have access to online gaming. Brian had been determined that kids would always be able to play Guidice Games, with or without an internet connection. They may not be able to team up in online play, but they wouldn't miss out on the majority of the gaming experience because of the lack either. New Moon Rising was no different, and the game had been thoroughly tested and debugged by both himself and his team. It was a project that took gamers back to Guidice Games' very first release, and Brian was excited and nervous about the project. He recalled Nina's enthusiasm about Ark's Roses and wondered whether she'd be willing to play the new game that was a continuation of the story from that one. He made a mental note to ask her the next time he saw her. He remembered her excitement at finding out he was the owner of Guidice Games. She hadn't been the least bit interested in his wealth or his company, but they'd spoken about the games and he'd mentioned his plans to keep the games offline as much as possible, and she'd been enthusiastic about it. She'd even offered some really good ideas that he planned to implement in the next few releases following New Moon Rising. When the bell rang, signaling the arrival of his food, Brian grabbed his wallet and ran down to collect it. He was surprised to see Leslie working at his desk and stopped on the way back to his office to chat. "Hey Les, working Saturday." "Hey boss." Les rolled back his chair, stretching out the kinks in his shoulders from hunching over in front of his computer. "Yeah, last night I was lying in bed staring at these glow-in-the-dark stars my daughter stuck up on the ceiling, and it occurred to me that some of the patterns we've used for the puzzles in NMR were back to front. When we rendered them, they were mirrored, so some gamers would never have been able to solve the patterns to unlock those levels. It would have been a nightmare, so I came in to fix them quickly. Won't be much longer, though." Brian stared at Les in shock. He recalled the levels he was talking about, but he'd passed them easily in his own test run of the game. He'd thought something was wrong, but hadn't been able to pinpoint it, and with everything that happened with Nina, and then Tristan, he'd forgotten all about it. While most hardcore gamers would have been able to work it out eventually, that sort of mistake could also cost them a following of loyal fans. "Les, remind me to slip a bonus into your check at the end of this month." Brian clapped him on the shoulder, and Les grinned. "You betcha, boss." Brian smiled as he made his way back to his office. While he ate, he typed an email to the accounts department, authorizing Les bonus for month end. The man had earned it with his quick thinking. Nina was thoroughly engrossed in her book when a voice interrupted her. Nina Jacobs. I'll be damned." She looked up to see the smiling face of Michael Jones grinning at her from the table next to her. "Michael, hi. Oh my gosh, it's been, well, ages. How are you?" Nina felt that momentary discomfort of a stranger bumping into someone they used to be quite close to but had long since lost contact with. Michael rose from his table, picking up his beer and walking to the seat next to her. "Mind if I join you?" He sat before Nina could do more than shake her head in response, leaning towards her eagerly. "Fancy bumping into you here, Nina. And I was thinking about you just the other day." "Oh." Nina eyed his broad shoulders, and the slightly contrived way he batted his deep brown eyes at her. "What were you thinking about, exactly?" "Now, Nina, I know we didn't part on the best of terms the last time we saw each other, but you have to admit, we had some good times together, didn't we?" Nina sighed, remembering how long it had taken her to get over the man now sitting casually next to her. They'd more or less grown up together, though their families had moved around a lot and both Nina and her sister had been homeschooled. Michael Jones was a familiar face in a constantly changing world, and the last time they'd bumped into each other, Michael had confessed his love for Nina. At least, that was until she'd found him in bed with her sister 2 months before they'd been about to get married. That was 4 years before, and she hadn't spoken to Sabrina since then, or to Michael for that matter. The last thing she remembered saying to him was that if he came near her again, she'd castrate him. "So, are you waiting for someone?" Michael looked around as though expecting to see someone walking towards them, and Nina fought the urge to roll her eyes. "Actually, no. I'm waiting for my movie to start." She looked at her watch, "which is about to happen in about 10 minutes, actually." She lifted her hand, signaling for the waiter to bring her the check. "Well, it's been good to see you, Michael, but I have to go now." "Nina, wait." Michael grabbed her hand, letting go when she stared pointedly at it. "Sorry, look, why don't you let me buy you dinner? For old time's sake? Please." Nina bit her lip, wondering what it was about this man that made it so difficult to say no. "Okay, sure. I guess you owe me one. What's your number?" She returned his eager smile, saving his number to her phone, and giving him a missed call before heading off for her movie. Brian's face flashed accusingly in front of her, but she blinked it away. Don't look at me like that. We're not exclusive yet. And anyway, Michael's just an old friend. Excuse me? The usher frowned at her as she took Nina's ticket, and Nina flushed. Just talking to myself. Sorry. She ignored the little voice inside her that whispered that getting involved with Michael again was a very bad idea. Hey there. Did you know that we've other hot romances like this that we want to release? But we need your help. Subscribing shows us that you're part of our journey and allows us to make more of these stories at a higher quality. So please, my queen, subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel now. Thanks. Now back to your story.
Chapter 4. 2 days had gone by with no word from Nina, and Brian was in a foul temper when he strode into the office on Monday morning. His meetings on Sunday had gone exactly as he'd expected, with most of the team being reluctant to reschedule the release date of New Moon Rising. Only 2 of his employees had seemed eager to bring it forward, which Brian suspected was either a sign of boredom with the project or treachery. He'd made a note of both of them. Corporate espionage was a criminal offense and was working behind the scenes to catch them in the act of passing insider information to his brother. They'd each been given separate fake projects to work on, and it was only a matter of time before one, or both of them, was leaked to Night Gaming, his brother's company. Still, it wasn't the thought of his staff betraying him which had Brian in a fury. It was the lack of communication from Nina. He was used to getting what he wanted. Generally his good looks and charms had it handed to him on a platter, and the fact that Nina hadn't made a single move to contact him after their night together made him think that perhaps she wasn't interested. It stung his ego, but more than that, it hurt more than he'd expected it to. He'd really felt a connection with Nina, and he thought she had too. He slammed his way into his office and pulled up short when he saw his sister sitting comfortably behind his desk. Jen, what are you doing here? Well, good morning to you too, Grumpy. Jen's eyebrow rose at his tone. He grimaced and walked over to the bar counter that lined one wall of his office, reaching for the fresh pot of coffee his PA had brewed in preparation for his arrival. He held it up to Jen and she nodded. I don't want angry coffee though, so make sure you don't put any of your temper in it. As planned, her comment made Brian chuckle. Angry coffee was a joke going back to their childhood, when their mother had cajoled them out of fits of temper by insisting that if they made anything while in a bad mood, their food would taste angry. Jen in particular had been fond of sending her coffee back to the kitchen stating that it was too angry to drink. With the coffee made, and Brian's mood slightly improved, he sat down opposite his sister. So, why the bad mood? Jen watched him over the rim of her cup as she took a sip. Brian sighed. It's Nina. Ah, yes. Nina. How did your date go on Friday? Brian winced, avoiding her eyes. Oh God, Brian. Please tell me you didn't sleep with her? He flushed and Jen slammed her cup down on the desk. Brian Guidice, you took the poor girl to bed after a single date? She's not a poor girl, Jennifer. She's a woman, a beautiful, independent woman, and she invited me to her bed. I didn't take her, as you so elegantly put it. Jen stared at her brother, and then whistled. Wow, you've got it bad, don't you? Brian groaned, placing his own mug on the desk and rubbing his face with his hands. I haven't heard anything from her since I left on Saturday. Well, have you tried calling or sending her a message? Jen's voice was matter of fact. No. I thought she'd contact me first. Women usually do. He cringed back as his sister flew to her feet, sparks flying in her sudden fury. Nina is clearly not most women, Brian. I can't believe how obtuse you can be sometimes. Honestly, if you weren't my brother, I'd be ashamed to know you. As it is, I look forward to the day when a woman takes that ego you seem to have developed and pops it with her stiletto. Or a few choice words. She snatched her purse and stormed to the door, turning back for one final word. Call Nina, Brian. If you're lucky, she'll forgive you for being a Class A jerk. She slammed the door on her way out, leaving Brian staring after her in bewilderment. What did I do? Nina slammed the book back into place on the shelf and turned to grab another from the trolley. She was stocking shelves but with none of her usual care and enjoyment. Brian hadn't called or messaged, and his line about it being more than a one-night stand seemed to be just that. A line. She snorted, drawing wary glances from the customers browsing the shelves next to her. Before she could pick up the next book, a hand snatched it from the trolley. I've got this, Nina. Why don't you go check the inventory at the back? Her friend and colleague, Lisa, leaned forward to whisper, You're scaring the customers. Her temper suddenly replaced by weariness, Nina smiled her thanks and made her way to the back, where she could be alone with her thoughts and her bad mood. Her run-in with Michael had made her eager to hear from Brian again, to replace bad memories with good ones, but when Saturday passed without a word from him, and then Sunday, she'd begun to suspect he wasn't going to get in touch. She pulled her phone from her purse, checking it for messages for the umpteenth time, but there were none. He wasn't going to contact her, and she might as well just forget it. Forget him. Or she could message him? No, if he wanted to see her again, he had to make the effort. And it would have to be one hell of an effort after he'd ignored her for 2 days following the best sex of her life. Nina groaned, slumping down in a chair, surrounded by books. That was the problem. What she'd felt with Brian went beyond anything else she'd ever felt with a guy. True, he was a gorgeous, billionaire CEO, and many women would claim to feel something they'd never felt before just for a chance to hang on to him. But he'd sat in her house, eaten the food she'd cooked for him, and raved about it to boot. Then he'd taken her to bed and made her feel things she'd never felt before. Surely that had to count for something? Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she stared at the screen as though she'd conjured a ghost. Brian Bookstore, the caller ID read. She should probably change his surname now that she knew what it was. The phone was still ringing, while she debated answering it. It would serve him right if she didn't, but Nina had never been one to enjoy playing games with people. She pressed the answer button. Hello? Nina. Hi. I didn't think you were going to answer. His voice sent shivers through her and she steeled herself. I'm at work, Brian. What can I do for you? Ouch. Well, I guess I deserved that. She didn't speak, heard him clear his throat awkwardly before he continued. Look, Nina, I'm sorry I didn't call you. I could use the excuse that I've been at work all weekend, but the truth is, I was waiting for you to call me. Most women. I'm not most women, Nina cut him off, her voice icy. No, of course not. I didn't mean. Look, I'm sorry. I should have called, and I didn't because I was behaving like a Class A jerk. Let me make it up to you, please? Dinner, tonight? I'll pick you up. I can't. I already have plans with an old friend. Nina winced at the reminder of the other reason for her temper. Michael had persisted until she'd agreed to go to dinner with him that evening, refusing to take no for an answer. Eventually she'd agreed just to get rid of him, although she couldn't deny the faint thrill she felt at his persistence. Oh, well, how about Wednesday night then? I can't make it tomorrow. I have meetings scheduled quite late and I'm not sure what time we'll finish. Okay, sure. Wednesday sounds good. Then, because she felt she'd capitulated too easily, she added, but don't think this gets you off the hook. You still need to make up for being a Class A jerk after Friday. Brian laughed, the sound raising goosebumps over Nina's arms. Deal. I'll see you on Wednesday. 7 o'clock. Nina hung up the phone, just as Lisa entered the office. "Oh, good. I was beginning to think you'd force me to deal with all the customers today. You know how I feel about people," she gave a mock shudder. "But now that you're smiling again, you can get out there and be all friendly to them so I don't have to." Nina chuckled and rose to her feet, slipping her phone back in her purse. Lisa was right, she was smiling, and it felt good. By 6 o'clock, her smile had slipped, and she was staring into her wardrobe with a disconsolate frown. What did a woman wear to a dinner date that wasn't a date with her ex-fiancé who cheated on her with her sister? Finally, she decided on jeans with a smart top, casual but classy. She released her braids from the tie they'd been in for work and let them hang free, the beads threaded through them clicking softly together. She would have to go get them redone in about 2 weeks, and she was getting a bit tired of the beads. She would have to see what else the woman at the salon had on offer. A bit of shimmery eyeshadow, some lip gloss, and a pair of suede boots completed her outfit. It was 7:15, and Michael still hadn't arrived as he'd promised. Typical. Nina rolled her eyes at her reflection. He'd always been late for everything, which was part of the reason she'd caught him with her sister the night of their engagement party. He'd been late for the speeches, and she'd gone looking for him, not even suspecting that he might be with her missing sister. Sabrina had a habit of disappearing during parties, a true introvert. Nina shook her head. All that was in the past. She'd tried to reconcile with Sabrina, but her sister had shut her down every time, and the last time Nina had tried to contact her, her number had changed. That was almost 2 years ago, and she'd resigned herself to feeling like an only child. Now, like a bad omen, Michael was back in her life and insisting on being a part of it. The doorbell rang, and Nina sighed. Only 20 minutes late, but hey, at least he'd shown up. She opened the door to find Michael standing there, sucking his thumb and clutching a freshly picked rose. He thrust it at her. "Hey, babe. That's for you. Look out for thorns." Nina took the rose, with a sneaky suspicion that he'd just stolen it from Mrs. Beachley's bushes that lined the fence. "Thanks, I'll just put it in water and then we can go." Sure. No rush." "No, there never is with you, is there?" Nina ran water into a slender vase, placed the rose in it and left it on the center of the table before walking back to the living room. Michael was eyeing her bookshelf, easily the largest piece of furniture she owned. "You always did like reading. You and your sister." Shall we go?" Nina held the door open, suddenly reluctant to have him in her home. "Sure, I got us a great table at Burger King." "Joking!" "I'm joking," he added hastily when he saw her face. Nina shut the door and locked it, before heading down the driveway to where Michael had parked at the pavement. He was already in the car, waiting for her, and she wondered why that surprised her. Michael had never been a man who understood the subtleties of escorting a woman to the car and opening doors for her. Then again, Nina had yet to meet a man who did. She wondered if Brian would, then shrugged the thought away. Women had fought for independence for far too long to have any right to be irritated when men gave it to them. Even on a date. She climbed into the car, ignoring the fast food bags that littered the footwell. Michael didn't say anything, just pulling out into the street with a reckless speed that reinforced her feelings that he hadn't changed a bit. This was going to be a long night. Dinner went surprisingly well. Michael was good company when he stopped trying to be charming, and their long history growing up together gave him and Nina something to talk about. He took her to a little restaurant that was just good enough to be popular, but not so good that they were too busy. The table he'd booked for them was secluded in an alcove away from the rest of the diners. He ordered her a glass of cola, remembering that she wasn't a fan of wine or other alcohol, and even though she was slightly irritated by him ordering without her asking what she wanted, she appreciated his effort. Still, when he began ordering food for both of them, she held up her hand and stopped him. "Excuse me, Michael, but I think I'd like to order for myself if you don't mind." "Oh, of course not. My apologies." He looked slightly irked by her reaction but good-naturedly allowed her to take over from him. She placed her order, garlic bread with cheese to start and lamb claftico for mains, while Michael chose the snails and a steak. "I'm not sure about dessert, I'll see how full I am after the meal." Of course. Michael smiled at her and their waitress took their menus, leaving to get their drinks ready. "So, how've you been, Nina? You're looking great." Michael leaned forward on the table. "I'm good, working in a bookstore. I co-own it." "Wow. That's a step up from when you were slaving away as a waitress." "Yeah, well, I was still studying my business management degree then, so I had to work part-time. Besides, a lot happens in 4 years." "Yeah, you can say that again. What about Sabrina? Last I heard she was working for some gaming company and earning big bucks as a PA to the boss." "I wouldn't know, we haven't spoken in 4 years." "Shit. Sorry, was that because of, you cheating on me with her?" Nina smiled wryly and shook her head. "It was the start of it, but then when I tried to make amends, she wasn't interested. So I've sort of left it. It's okay though. I never really got on with my sister, you know that." "Yeah, sure. What you guys had in common was books and writing. Other than that, you fought all the time." "Exactly. Still, I'm sorry for the way things ended between us, Nina. You deserved better. You deserve better." Nina shrugged her shoulders. "Yeah, well. That's life, I guess." "So, are you single?" "Not really. It's a bit complicated at the moment though. Not quite sure where we are at the moment." "Oh. Sounds messy." "No, not messy. Just the start of something. You always seem to come back into my life right around when things are getting interesting." "Yeah, well, I always did like intrigue. It makes things fun. Life's too boring without it." "I guess so. So when did you see Sabrina last?" "Oh, about 6 months ago. We bumped into each other at a convention. She's looking good. I got her number, if you want it." "Sure, thanks. I'll get it from you later." She changed it 2 years ago, and I haven't been able to get hold of her since. She told me. Said she lost her phone. Bit silly if you ask me. Nina chose not to remind him of how many phones he'd lost over the years, grateful when their food arrived. They ate in silence for a few moments. "So, what are you doing with yourself now?" Nina looked up at Michael between bites. "I'm working for myself. Sort of between jobs at the moment, but I have some gigs lined up. My art is proving to be popular with certain galleries and I end up selling a painting or two every couple months. It's enough to tide me over until I can get more regular work. I mostly do contracting." "So you're actually doing something with your painting now?" "That's great." Nina smiled at him and Michael nodded. "Yeah, I took what you said seriously. Did some art courses, went to Europe for a year. It was fun. Then Dad died and I had to come back, but the family business wasn't really for me. Never was an office type." Nina laughed. "I don't think any of us were office types. I'm surprised to hear Sabrina is working as a PA. She hated admin. Sorry to hear about your dad." "Thanks. And yeah, if you ask me, I think she's a bit more than a PA." Michael trailed off at the look in Nina's eyes. Anyway, how's your food? It's great, thanks. They make good lamb here. Yeah, they do. There was silence, both of them fumbling for things to say until Michael got the nerve to speak again. So, do you fancy maybe going back to your place after this? Having a cup of coffee? No, Michael. It's been nice to catch up and stuff, but I don't think it's a good idea for us to see each other again. Why not? He looked affronted. Because I've moved on with my life now. I'm seeing someone else, and I really like him. I don't want to mess it up by getting involved with my ex. Who said anything about getting involved? I'm not someone you can scratch an itch with, Michael. I happen to take commitment very seriously, and I've committed to Brian. So thanks for dinner, but I think it would be best if we don't meet again. She waved her hand for the waitress, who appeared a moment later. I'd like to take this away, please, and you can bring us the bill. Oh, now, wait a minute, Nina. There's no need to cut our evening short. I'm sorry if I was a bit forward, but you know me. I've always gone out for what I want, and I've never really let anyone or anything stand in my way. Oh, I remember that all too well, Michael, and I don't really fancy being the person you go after next. I've made a life for myself now, and I don't intend to change it. Please get the bill. I'll pay for my meal and be on my way. Now you're just being offensive, Nina. You don't have to pay for your meal. I'll cover it. And take you home. Nina sat back in her chair. She wasn't afraid of Michael. He was a sleazebag, but harmless otherwise. It was a pity, because he was actually really good-looking, and once upon a time, she'd been able to imagine creating a life with him. Now, it seemed that wouldn't have been a good idea, and she was grateful for the reprieve she'd been granted, even if it had led to an estrangement with her sister. All right, thanks, Michael. She decided it would be better to be gracious in her dismissal of the man. After all, he was offering to buy her dinner, and it had been a good meal, even if a bit uncomfortable in terms of conversation. She couldn't help comparing their evening with the 2 evenings she'd spent in Brian's company. Unfortunately for Michael, his personality didn't even begin to compare to the way Brian made her feel, and she had to wonder if it was because of their history, or if Brian was just an amazing man. She decided she would wait to see how he was on their date on Wednesday before making up her mind about him. After all, he still had to make up for ignoring her for 2 days. When Michael dropped her at her house half an hour later, she took her sister's number from him and thanked him again for the meal. He leaned over to kiss her, but she held up her hand and shook her head. Dinner was nice, Michael, but I've already said I'm not interested. Take care of yourself. Goodbye. She climbed out of the car and shut the door behind her, rolling her eyes when Michael revealed his childish temper by revving the car and speeding away. She was making her way up the drive when Mrs. Beachley popped her head over the fence. Was that young Michael Jones? Holy cow, Mrs. Beachley. You nearly gave me a heart attack. Best you stay away from that young man, Nina Jacobs. He stole one of my roses this evening. I was watching from the window. Up to no good, I bet. Just like always. Nina sighed. Of course, Mrs. Beachley. Good night.
Chapter 5. Tuesday passed in a blur for Brian, who was too busy implementing his plans to thwart his brother's industrial espionage to worry about his upcoming date with Nina. He did, however, take the time to send her a message wishing her a good day and telling her he was looking forward to seeing her the next night. He was gratified to receive a response a few moments later, reciprocating his comments. It was interesting to note that as much as Nina was always at the back of his mind, and as eager as he was to see her again, he wasn't driven to maintain contact with her. His previous encounters with women, of which he'd had a few, had always consisted of a frenzied bout of passionate texting, followed by sex that lasted a month or two, before his interest waned. He'd discussed it with Jen before, and she'd told him it was perfectly normal to be interested due to lust, but that love was an entirely different matter. Brian jerked back from his desk in shock. He couldn't be in love with Nina Jacobs, could he? It simply wasn't possible. They'd only just met. While he'd never been an inconsiderate lover, he'd never really thought of himself as the committing type. Love was a foreign concept in his life, at least romantic love. He'd never been the least bit interested in settling down with a woman. Still, he'd never felt this slow-burning desire for anyone before. Nina aroused him physically, but more than that, she played with his emotions and his mind. She was a puzzle, and he wanted to solve her. That was it, not love. Once he'd figured her out, he would grow tired and move on, the same way he always did with women. It was natural, and although the thought saddened him, he was relieved to be able to justify his fascination with Nina. Turning back to his computer, he logged into his emails. Sure enough, there was one from his team, advising him of the merits of changing the marketing and bringing the release date forward. They'd been punting the release of New Moon Rising to the public for 6 months. Changing the date now would be a disaster. Release dates were carefully timed to coincide with periods which market research indicated were most favorable for buyers, and he was reluctant to change it. Only one of his team members recommended doing so, and it was the same team member who had worked on the mirrored puzzles Les had picked up. Not only was Kyle Hemsworth a spy, but he was a saboteur as well, and that wouldn't go down well with HR. The only issue now was proving it beyond a doubt, so that the company could charge him with the criminal offense. Not that Brian thought it would necessarily come to that, but he knew that he would need to set an example. He was a lenient boss as long as the work was done, the deadlines were met, and the quality of work was exceptional. If that didn't happen, he was hell on earth for the poor guy who didn't meet his expectations. Jen had often told him that he had too much of dad in him, but the old man had known what it took to make a business successful, and he'd grown Guidice Games from a small startup company to the billion-dollar corporation it was today. While the company had grown, the ethics that Martin Guidice had instilled in his staff and his children remained firmly in place, and the loyalty of staff was always rewarded above and beyond the norm. With a sigh, Brian shut down his computer. That's why it was so hard to consider Hemsworth a traitor. He'd been treated just like one of the other employees, rewarded generously for his hard work, and treated fairly when he didn't perform to the standard expected of him, which had only happened once, according to the records HR had sent to Brian on his request. It made no sense for him to betray the company he worked for, unless Tristan had offered him a sizable sum in order to do so. He would have to find a way to investigate his brother's methods and stop him implementing them again in the future. For now, though, it was time for him to take a look at his plans to knock the socks off Nina Jacobs at their date the next evening. He fully intended to pull out all the stops, and the first thing he planned to do was to gather intel on her favorite dining places and book out the restaurant. He was halfway through implementing the plans when he stopped. Nina had already been to his house, and she knew how wealthy he was. But not once in all the time they'd spent together had she indicated that it mattered to her. If anything, she'd seemed loath to accept his wealth as commonplace. She'd invited him for dinner at her house, cooked him a homely but delicious meal, and hadn't expected him to contribute more than a bottle of wine. It was highly unlikely that she would be impressed by ostentatious displays of wealth, and where Brian had used them to great effect with previous relationships, this was another reminder of how different Nina was from other women he'd dated. While she may be appreciative of the comforts his wealth afforded, it was unlikely that she would be grateful for it, which meant that he wasn't quite sure what to do to impress Nina. In fact, he'd hit a dead end in his plans, and with no one else to turn to, he snatched the phone from his desk and dialed his sister's number. She answered distractedly, and Brian had a moment to wonder if he was disturbing her, before he decided that his needs were more important than anything Jen might be doing. "I need your help." "With Tristan?" Jen sounded puzzled. "No, not with Tristan. With Nina. I'm taking her out tomorrow night, and I was halfway through planning an extravagant affair with booking out a restaurant and hiring a band. You know, the usual. When it occurred to me that Nina may not be the sort of woman to appreciate extravagance like that. Well. It seems my dear brother may finally be learning how to understand women. Will wonders never cease?" Jen chuckled. Mock me all you want, Jen. But I need your help. I don't know what to do, and it's really important that I impress her. Ah, you're no fun when you're lovesick. Bring me food and I'll tell you how to woo your young Miss Jacobs. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Your usual burger, okay? Perfect. Brian hung up the phone and ordered takeaways for collection. He'd pick up the food on the way to Jen's house. As he left the office, he felt the thrill of adrenaline pumping through his veins. No woman had ever made him feel excited about planning a date, but it seemed that Nina was right. She wasn't most women. The next morning, Nina received a message from Brian, telling her to dress for dancing that evening. She wasn't sure whether they were actually going to go to a club, but she spent the day discussing outfits with Lisa and debating the merits of stilettos with the heels she'd bought when she'd taken up ballroom and Latin dancing. Eventually, they decided that she would dress in a silver thigh-length dress that hugged her cleavage before flowing down her legs. The bodice was decorated with sequins and the back was open, with just a few straps holding it in place. Nina hadn't worn it since the last dancing competition she'd entered, but she was relieved to see it still fit. Her strapless bra matched her skin tone, so she wasn't concerned about it showing at the back. Her silver stilettos glimmered in the light, and while elegant, they were still more comfortable than some of the other shoes she owned. Excitement thrummed through her veins as she applied her makeup. Not too much, because she'd never really liked the feel of wearing a mask of gunk on her face, and her mama had always told her that she had beautiful skin and should show it off, not cover it up. Since her teenage years, she'd outgrown the rebellious phase and had reverted to more natural makeup. A shimmer of eyeshadow, a hint of mascara, and some lip gloss, and she was ready. She eyed her braids, wondering what she could do with them. If Brian was taking her dancing, and he'd indicated he was, then it was a bad idea to leave them loose. Moves like they'd pulled on the night of Jen's party was sure to have Brian getting slapped in the face by her waist-length braids, and if she'd learned anything from her dancing lessons, it was that her hair stung like a whip when it hit right. Nina giggled as she recalled her poor dancing instructor the first time he'd spun her after she'd just had her hair braided. He'd worn the welt across his cheek for a week and told everyone who'd asked that his boyfriend had gotten a bit excited in the bedroom. She didn't think Brian would have the same sense of humor about it, so she opted for twisting them back into a knot at the base of her neck. Eyeing her reflection, she was pleased with the result of her ensemble, which left her looking chic and sexy. She was also nervous and ready 20 minutes early, which was unheard of for her. She was well known among her friends for always keeping them waiting. Trying to calm her nerves, she did a quick walkthrough of the house, making sure it was as immaculate as it had been when she'd finished cleaning it the previous night. It was, and there were still 15 minutes to go before Brian was due to pick her up. She double-checked her clutch purse, cell, lipstick, credit card. She had everything she could possibly need for the evening, and there were still 10 minutes left. A wrap. She'd forgotten a wrap. She hurried into her bedroom, pulling open her cupboard and hesitating before choosing a black silken wrap that shimmered with silver threads woven through the fabric. Perfect. She'd just closed the cupboard when the doorbell rang. Right on time. She hurried through to the living room and opened the door, a smile hovering on her lips. Hi! Brian stood on the threshold, his tuxedo immaculately tailored and showing off his tall frame to perfection. He smiled down at her and bent down to kiss her. You look beautiful, he murmured against her lips, sending a thrill through her as he pulled back and held out his arm. Shall we go? Thank you. You're looking quite debonair yourself. She fluttered her lashes at him, and he grinned. He waited while she locked the door behind her, then escorted her to his car, an Audi, not quite top of the line, but certainly in the upper ranges, she noticed. He held the door for her, waiting until she was settled before closing it gently behind her and moving round to get into the driver's seat. There's a little gift for you in the cubby hole, he spoke as he pulled away and eased into the traffic. I thought flowers might be a bit cliché, and since you've mentioned how much you hate clichés, I decided to get you something more useful. Curiosity tugged at her and she opened the cubby, pulling out the small gift-wrapped parcel inside. She shook it, twisting it round in her fingers as she tried to guess what it was. You can open it, you know? Brian's tone said he was laughing at her. I know. But half the fun is in guessing. Nina grinned at him and he rolled his eyes. I don't have the patience for that. Just open your gift, woman. Bossy. Nina laughed, slipping her finger under the sellotape that held the package closed. It opened easily, and she flipped it over, letting the object inside slide out into her palm. What is it? I noticed when I came to dinner that your recipe book was lying flat on the counter. That's a book stand, designed to hold your books while you work or cook, or just get tired of holding the book. And if you look under the seat, the second part of the gift is hidden there. He grinned like an excited child, eager to see her reaction. She reached under the seat and pulled out a slightly bulkier object also wrapped. This time, she didn't hesitate and opened it immediately to reveal a lamp in the shape of a slender cat. It attaches to the stand, so you can rest the book on it and have the pages lit while reading. It's lovely, thank you. But how did you know I like cats? The placemats you used for dinner. They had pictures of cats on them. Nina stared at him. Brian, MMHM, you do realize that your powers of observation are ever so slightly creepy, right? He laughed, glancing over at her quickly before turning his attention back to the road. I may have been told that once or twice before. I can't really help it though. It's all those years spent gaming. I notice a lot of things other people normally wouldn't. Of course, it must be the gaming. She teased him, enjoying the sound of his laughter. So where are we going? Ah, now if I told you that, it wouldn't be a surprise, would it? Nina chuckled. I suppose not, but can I guess? You can try. Brian sounded smug, as though she'd never be able to guess. She wasn't sure she would. She didn't recognize the neighborhood Brian had been driving through for the last 10 minutes, but she would try. She began by listing all the upmarket restaurants she could think of, Brian shaking his head at each one, his grin growing wider all the time. When she ran out of restaurants she knew, she began making up names, each one more ridiculous than the last until both of them were laughing so hard they couldn't continue. It was a childish game, but fun, and Nina was delighted that Brian had joined in with it. As they turned into the parking lot of their destination, though, Nina's laughter died on a gasp of surprise. From the building, a neon sign announced their destination. A cabaret dancer kicking her leg high into the air, lit in shades of red and gold. Cantare? You brought me to Cantare? Brian looked over at her as he parked the car in the crowded lot. You said you liked dancing, and your moves at Jen's party hinted that you'd taken lessons. I thought you'd like it. Nina turned to look at him, her eyes sparkling, an excited grin pulling at her lips. Are you kidding? I've wanted to come here for ages. But it's not really a place a girl comes without a dancing partner. I could kiss you. The teasing light faded from Brian's eyes as it was replaced by desire as he focused on her lips. If you do that, we might not make it inside. His voice was husky as he issued the warning. Nina's chuckle was threaded with arousal as she shook her head. In that case, the kiss will have to wait until later. I want to watch the show and then hit the dance floor. Right? As my lady commands. Brian exited the car and strode round to open her door with a flourish, holding out his hand to help her out. Why, thank you, kind sir. Nina smiled up at him, and Brian's hand tightened on hers briefly before he let go and closed the door behind her. He offered her his arm again, and she threaded her hand into the crook of his elbow. As they walked into the restaurant, the hostess came forward to greet them. Guidice, table for two. Brian spoke quietly, and Nina noticed that though the hostess' eyes widened slightly at his name, she was professional enough not to fawn over him. Of course, Mr. Guidice. Right this way, please. The restaurant was crowded, but an intimate atmosphere was created by the red and gold decor, and the small circular tables that accommodated 2 to 4 patrons. Candles floated in vases filled with water and rose petals on each table, and the lighting was dim. The seats were arranged so that diners could focus on the show, which would be performed on the stage during the 3-course meal. Nina took in the whole restaurant. The feeling of luxury and old-world elegance combined to create an atmosphere of excitement, mystery, and romance. Her hand squeezed Brian's arm in her excitement, and he smiled down at her. Like it? I love it. Good. I'd hoped you would. The hostess indicated their table, and Brian held out her chair, sliding it expertly under her as she sat. You did that well. Nina smirked at him as he sat next to her. Had a lot of practice with the ladies? Brian laughed. Only one lady, actually. My sister. Dad was rather big on etiquette. Made me and my brother practice endlessly until it was so drummed into us. It's second nature. I didn't know you had a brother. Ah, well, that's because Tristan and I aren't really on speaking terms. I'm sorry. Nina's hand touched his, and he curled his fingers round to hold it. She watched their entwined hands as she spoke. I know how that is. My sister and I, we haven't spoken in 4 years. Not since, well, it's a long story, but it does hurt. What's her name? My sister? Sabrina. She's 2 years younger than me. We're not very alike, but we used to be really close. Dad died when we were teenagers, and just after Sabrina turned 20, Mama went too. Things were strained between us when we lost her, but it was 2 years later that they really took a turn for the worst. But that's old news now, and depressing. Let's just focus on tonight. She smiled up at him, her eyes still haunted with memories, and Brian leaned over and kissed her. Her lips parted willingly beneath his, and for long moments they were lost in the taste and feel of each other, him minty and possessive, her smooth chocolate and yielding. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing heavily. The diners around them began clapping, and they looked around, guiltily thinking it was because of the kiss. But the diners were focused on the stage, where the curtains had lifted and a trio of girls stood in the spotlight. With a relieved laugh, Brian and Nina settled back, prepared to enjoy the show. The meal was absolutely delicious. Nina and Brian ate their way through halloumi starters, a main course of kinklip and prawns, and chocolate mousse layered with fresh cream and strawberries for dessert. By the end of the meal, they were both convinced they'd be rolling around the dance floor. But the show had engaged so much of their attention that they'd barely been aware of how much they were consuming. The singing and dancing had been fabulous. At one point, Nina had leaned over to Brian and said, I wish I could kick my legs as high as that. The image had made his eyes darken with desire, and he'd looked at her with an expression that sent shivers coursing through her. Sweetheart, I can think of much better ways to spend our time with your legs splayed like that. For a moment, Nina was tempted to ask him to take them home, but she'd been looking forward to dancing with him for ages, and she stroked his arm with her fingers in an unconsciously arousing gesture of acquiescence. Later, I want to dance first. Of course, but let's wait for the meal to settle. I don't think I could do more than roll right now. Brian patted his belly, which, to Nina's appreciative gaze, was flat enough to wash clothes on. I would hate for your reputation to suffer at my hands, so I'm happy to wait. She teased him, and Brian laughed. What reputation? Oh, billionaire playboy, gentleman, world champion ballroom dancer. You know about my foray into dancing then. Nina was amused to see Brian's ears reddening as he suddenly looked uncomfortable. I watched some of the videos. You're really good. Thank you. Why did you stop dancing? Oh, too much pressure, not enough time. I still dance occasionally, but not for competitions anymore. Only on hot dates? Actually, only on one hot date. You'd be surprised how many women don't want to dance. Really? Why's that? I don't know. Probably scared they'll make fools of themselves, or something silly like that. Ah yes, the old booby trap of feminine pride. I know it well. You do. I'm a woman, aren't I? Nina smirked at him, and he leaned over to kiss her again, tasting the strawberries and chocolate of dessert, mingled with her own unique taste. When she was thoroughly breathless from his kiss, he pulled back, a smug glint in his eyes. Honey, you're more than just a woman. You're breathtaking. Nina's breathless laugh gave away her blush, and Brian ran his fingertips over her cheek. He was pleased to note that she was definitely blushing, a fact given away by her warmer than usual skin. Deciding to take mercy on her, and finally feeling ready to dance, he pushed back from the table and held out his hand to her. Shall we? Let's. Nina grinned up at him and placed her hand in his, allowing him to draw her smoothly to her feet and lead her onto the dance floor. As he pulled her into his arms, Nina wished that the night would never end.
Chapter 6. By the time they left Cantere, Brian felt as though he was going to implode. Nina had used every opportunity to tease and taunt him with her body as he led her expertly round the dance floor. Once they were seated in the car, he kept his hands on the steering wheel as he spoke. Your place or mine? That depends. On? Are you going to ignore me for 2 days after we sleep together again? Brian groaned, throwing his head back against the headrest. You're never going to let me forget that, are you? Nina giggled, the sound light and cheerful. Nah, I get the feeling you don't make mistakes very often, so it's best if I keep this one handy to make sure your ego doesn't run away from you. So, that still doesn't answer my question. Your place or mine? One-track mind, huh? Nina laughed, but Brian could hear the desire in her voice. Which one is closer? Mine. Yours it is then. Sure. No, but I'm sure I want you, so you'd better hurry before I have a chance to second-guess my decision. Brian took her at her word, driving as fast as possible without breaking speed limits. They pulled up at his house, and the gate opened smoothly. Unlike the night Nina had come here to attend Jen's birthday, the house was in darkness, only the light from the porch was still on. Brian pulled around the side of the house and into the garage, parking the car next to an Aston Martin. When Nina climbed out, not waiting for him to open her door, she gasped. The garage held 6 cars, all classics, and in mint condition. Are these yours? Sort of. My dad was a collector. I like cars, but not enough to collect them. These were just his favorites. Tristan and I both got about 20 different vehicles when he died. He saw the question on her face and continued, Jen got the motorbikes. Somehow, I didn't really picture your sister as a motorbike type. You should see her do motocross. The girl's a demon. Kicks but with the best of them. There was pride in his voice as he led the way into the house, switching on lights as they went. You're really close to your sister, aren't you? She's my best friend. Brian spoke simply, turning to smile at Nina as they entered the kitchen. Would you like a drink? Nina stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his waist and lifting her face for his kiss. No, I think we've been patient enough. Why don't you show me your bedroom, Mr. Guidice?
Oh no, another love scene had to be taken out due to YouTube's policies.
If you haven't already, join Romancely Audio Velvet to get love scenes for all stories.
Link to join is in the description. Pause this and do that.
It's okay, we'll wait.
If you're already a member, the love scene reference is Her Alpha CEO, Chapter 6, Love Scene 3.
Signed up?
Good, now back to the story.
She cradled him close, wondering as she did if she would ever be able to let go of him.
Chapter 7. A long time ago, in a land of green, gold, and sunlight, lived a girl with golden hair. Her name was Arabella. Now this girl was something else. She had a mischievous glint in her emerald eyes, a pertinent nose, and always had an impish smile on her face. Arabella was 8 summer cycles old, born in the humid night of Letha. She knew many things, saw many things, but said nothing. She knew the routines of the people around her and how to be able to give her tutor the slip. She did not like her tutor and thought of him as a sawdust-stuffed old fart. He was boring and she often fell asleep during his tutoring sessions. She awoke early one morning, with the wind coming through the open window, playing gently over her hair. The breeze was warming and the sun starting to wake from its slumber. She stretched and grinned, got up out of bed and dressed quickly, in a long white robe with blue trim on the sleeves and hem, plaiting her long hair without bothering to brush it, slipped her soft shoes on and opened the door slowly. Peering around the corner, she noted there was nobody there. Walked softly along the corridor to the stairs and peeked down. Nobody, She was in luck. Quietly sneaked down the stairs, knowing exactly where to tread so that they didn't squeak. She came to the entrance hall. Peeping around the corner, keeping herself concealed, she saw nothing. Giggling with delight, she ran for the door, pushed the heavy doors open, took a deep breath and smelt freedom. She smiled, hitched up her skirt and ran before anyone saw her, reveling in her escape. She ran faster down the paved road out to the fields which beckoned her with their lush green and glinting blue in the distance. Finally reaching the grass, she slowed down a bit but kept going. There was a willow next to the river, and she'd been yearning to go there. She saw many things on her way, butterflies of all colors flitting around, and a few bunnies, but she didn't stop to see more. Finally, at the water's edge, the river tumbled along crystal clear, making soothing sounds. She could see right to the bottom covered in pebbles but knew from previous experience that it was deeper than it looked. Looking around, she notices a log, not too big, but big enough to help her into the tree. She pushed and pulled it along to the base of the willow, and after much blasphemy, got it positioned against the tree so she could reach the lowest thick branch. Smiling contently at her handiwork, she tucked her skirt into her bloomers and climbed up into the tree, making her way to a branch that was over the river. Sitting down, she looked around her. She could make out the manor house in the distance, and satisfied that she couldn't be easily spotted, relaxed. She listened to the bees and the songs of the birds, the gentle swaying whisper of the long, soft branches of the tree. Thinking hard of what mischief she could get up to, she remembered watching her grandmother do a strange dance and moving her arms and hands. Her older sister never did that kind of dance. Hers was different, more agitated, more impassioned. Thinking of her sister brought to mind her new tutor with a grin. The mischief could start there today. Some ice-cold water in a pail, balanced carefully to tip eloquently down upon them, opening the door. Giggling with the thought, her mind returned to her grandmother. She missed her. She'd been gone for 2 summers already, to some place north. And while thinking of her grandmother, Arabella started to mimic the movements she had seen her grandmother do while she hid in the wardrobe. Balancing carefully on the branch, Arabella continued, finding it calmed her down, and felt like cool liquid flowing over her skin. Closing her eyes, she swayed gently with the movements, lost in a world not of her own. After a few minutes, she noticed that the light that was badgering her eyelids was gone, but the sounds of the area were still the same. Running down the corridor to her room, she slammed the door shut and bolted it. Turning around slowly, she wiped her eyes and moved to her bed. Staring out the window, with tears streaming down her face, she wished her grandmother was there. This was the worst birthday ever. Flinging herself face down onto the bed and sobbing into the pillow, she thought, 13 is unlucky, and I have only just started the summer cycle. Falling into a restless sleep, Arabella clutched her pillow and held it tight. Looking down at his daughter, her father noticed the tear-stained cheeks and how young she was. Breathing a sigh of relief, he softly sat down on her bed. He'd looked everywhere for her and sent the guards out to find her. He never thought she would be in her room. It was the last place he'd looked. Shaking her gently awake and calling her name, he waited until Arabella was mostly awake. "We need to talk, young lady." Arabella blinked and sat up, but cuddled her pillow to her, watching her father. He's going to send me away, she thought. Watching her face and the emotions playing over it, her father started talking. "Do you know what happened? I heard all about it from your sister, but I want your version." Taking a breath, Arabella quickly explained. "I lost my temper because I'm doing meaningless tasks and not learning anything, and I'm frustrated. And I have no time for myself." Her father nodded. "Okay, then we need to remedy that. You need more balance. Did you know that the body is made up of mostly water?" Arabella shook her head. "That's how you nearly killed your tutor. You boiled him from the inside out." Seeing tears ready to spill, her father consoled her. "Don't worry, he will be okay. He will be in the sick room for a few days, and his blisters have been seen to. He will have a suntan for a while, though." Her father smiled. "You will also spend some more time with your older sister." Seems the two of you will be able to keep each other out of grievous mischief. Arabella looked at her father. You're not sending me away for almost killing someone? No, her father said. It happens to all of us at one time or another. The trick is not to do it again. Now sleep peacefully and we'll start off fresh in the morning. Smiling wanly, Arabella nodded and settled back into bed. Tomorrow will be better. It has to be. Nina paused the game on the console, sitting back in her chair with a huff. Brian was watching her, enjoying the sight of her playing his game. Well, what do you think? I love it. It's just like playing Arc's Roses when we were kids. But better. Nina grinned at him in delight, and Brian felt the thrill of excitement at her reaction. They'd been playing New Moon Rising for most of Saturday morning, and Nina's response to the game had been better than he'd hoped for. Cautiously, Brian decided to play his trump card. Would you like to visit Guidice Games on Monday? See what we do there. Nina looked at him in delight. Really? Really? You've had some great ideas about this game, and even though it's too late into development to work it in, there are other projects on the go that you'd be great at. I'd love to have your input on them. Nina squealed, launching herself at him, making him laugh with delight. Monday morning arrived in a whirl of anticipation for Nina. She'd spent the weekend with Brian, and they'd had lunch with Jen on Sunday. When they arrived at the office building which housed Guidice Games, Nina gasped. He took her on the grand tour, and she was so excited that she could barely think straight. It was on their way to the cafeteria for lunch that she felt Brian tense next to her and looked up to see a man approaching them. He looked familiar, but it wasn't until Brian stepped into his path and greeted him that Nina realized who he was. Tristan, what are you doing here? Brian's voice was flat and unwelcoming. Tristan smiled, his expression smug. I'm here to put you in your place, Brian. You took what rightfully belonged to me, and now I've finally succeeded in proving our father wrong. I do have what it takes to manage a company and make it a success. Night gaming has finally overthrown you, the way I always knew it would. Only because you succumbed to corporate espionage. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? He did no such thing, Brian. The words came from a woman who up until then had been standing slightly behind him. She held a clipboard, stepping forward to slip her hand into Tristan's, her gaze defiant. Sabrina, I see you and my brother have become an item. Beside him, Nina gasped, her hands coming up to her face as she stared at her sister. Sabrina? The woman looked at Nina as though she was in a state of shock, and after an inarticulate cry, she turned and hurried away from the three of them. What the hell? Tristan looked torn for a minute, then turned and hurried after her, leaving Brian and Nina staring at each other in surprise. Sabrina's your sister? You know her? Nina looked as though she was about to collapse, and Brian wrapped his arm around her shoulders, leading her swiftly to an empty meeting room. She collapsed in a chair. We were involved briefly a few years ago. I hired her to do some work on a game. It didn't last long, he hastened to assure her, but Nina shrugged off his reassurance. I need to see her. I need to talk to her, explain that what happened, that it's in the past. I just want my sister back. Brian nodded. I understand. I'll speak to Tristan. See what we can arrange. Thank you. She stared at him, her dark eyes clouded with shock and determination. It's time for us all to make things right with our families. Reluctantly, Brian had to agree with her. He wasn't sure what Tristan had meant by proving himself to his father, unless it was the way they'd always been pitted against each other, even as children, but his growing feelings for Nina required that he put aside his desire to rub his success in Tristan's face. He was determined to reunite Nina and Sabrina, even though he knew now that the reason Nina had seemed familiar when they first met was due to his past with her sister. They were nothing alike, of course not, and Brian appreciated Nina for who she was. It was just that somehow, things between them had grown even more complicated and he wasn't sure how to deal with it. Nina, you do realize that any relationship you build with your sister now may be built on her desire to find out about Guidice Games? What? She glared at him in an expression so similar to Sabrina's when he'd accused his brother of corporate espionage, that he winced. I have evidence of corporate espionage by night gaming. He held up a hand to silence her protest. I'm not saying it's Sabrina. It could be Tristan. But regardless, you're going to need to be careful. I'm not an idiot, Brian. I won't give away any of your work secrets to your ex-lover. Her voice was venomous, and Brian sighed. This was going to take some careful planning to avoid becoming nasty. If you want more BWWM romances like this, please, my love, be sure to subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel. I look forward to spending more time with you. Subscribe and let's make it happen.
Chapter 8. So, Brian said, the word coming out slowly and softly, how are things going with your sister? Are you getting along so far? Nina was surprised he would ask. Not just because of the whole former relationship thing, but because the evening had just been so pleasant and enjoyable with the absence of any talk that was family awkward related. They'd met for dinner after Brian had apologized for his high-handedness about Sabrina and made up for it in other ways. Brian had arranged a meeting between the two sisters, liaising with Tristan on the matter, and she was still surprised at how well it had gone. That had been 2 weeks ago, and Sabrina and Nina were meeting regularly, trying to rekindle their sisterly bonds. Still, she knew Brian wouldn't have asked if he didn't expect an answer. An honest one, at that. Actually, she said, her own reply coming out even slower and more softly than his, so far, it's not exactly what I expected. His expression changed not at all, but he asked, how so? She shrugged, nudging back another strand of hair that blew into her face and pulling his jacket more snugly around herself. Well, for one thing, Sabrina's idea of reconciliation seems to be asking me a lot of questions about my relationship with you in Guidice Games and dodging any questions I ask about her position and relationship with Tristan at Night Gaming. She waited for a smug I told you so, but Brian's reply was instead a very careful, I see. Even though he didn't ask for more information, she found herself continuing anyway. Sabrina will be leaving town after tomorrow, and I know almost nothing about her and more about Night Gaming, although the history of the company and its mission statement and where its national and international offices are located are just about anything I could find out myself by an online search. Brian sipped his wine, but again said nothing, just waited for her to continue, should she want to. The sky behind him was smudged dark blue, the fat full moon hovering over his left shoulder. The only other light came from the candles flickering inside the hurricane globes on the tables, but it was enough to allow her to see his expression. Unfortunately, she couldn't tell by his expression what he was thinking, and that bothered her a lot. Not that she wanted to know what he thought about her situation with Night Gaming, but because she wanted to know what he thought about her. If he considered her naive for not realizing what he had about her relationship with her sister, or foolish for having disregarded his warning, or ridiculous for clinging to the idea that she had made the right choice. Especially since she was no longer clinging to that idea. With every new meeting she had with Sabrina, her suspicions about her sister and her motives grew stronger. She had blown off their movie date tonight regardless of her reason for doing so had only cemented her fear that what Brian had told her was true. Sabrina Jacobs, her younger sister, was only fostering a relationship because she'd hoped Nina would give her insight into Brian's business. Which, of course, she would never do. Her relationship with the owner of Guidice Games was pertinent to Sabrina only in as much as her boyfriend and Brian were brothers. Period. Now that she had realized she had no intention of playing corporate spy, Sabrina was no longer interested. Nina wouldn't be surprised if, before their scheduled breakfast even ended tomorrow afternoon, she manufactured some reason to never have to see her again. Thanks to her job, the position Sabrina filled at Night Gaming was probably a ruse, an excuse to be close to Tristan, or something of the sort. Nina wouldn't be surprised if Tristan fired her sister, or he discovered something in her work history that presented a conflict of interest. Oh, he'd find some way to make it sound plausible. He might even give her a generous severance package, though she doubted it. But there was certainly reason to believe her new position at Night Gaming wouldn't be hers for long. She looked at Brian. You were right, she said, forcing herself to admit the truth. I think the only reason Tristan hired Sabrina was because he assumed she would share what she knows about Guidice games with him. Brian eyed her warily now. Did she ask you about New Moon Rising? She shook her head. Not specifically, no. Not yet, anyway. But she did ask an awful lot of questions about you and the company. I wouldn't be surprised if the particulars of the game were next on her to-do list. And what did you tell her about Guidice games? Brian asked, his voice revealing nothing of what he might be thinking about. She smiled. I told her about the history of the company and its mission statement and where its national and international offices are located. You know. Anything she could discover by doing an online search. Brian smiled back. That's my girl. For a moment, neither of them spoke, neither of them moved, neither even seemed to breathe. Brian dropped his gaze from Nina's eyes to her mouth, then looked into her eyes again. She felt her lips part almost of their own volition, though whether it was because she intended to say something, or for another reason entirely, she wasn't sure. The moment stretched taut, and still neither spoke or moved. Then, for one scant, insane instant, it almost seemed as if he were dipping his head toward hers, tilting it slightly, as if he intended to kiss her? Nina thought frantically. Oh, surely not. They hadn't spent much time together since the discovery that Sabrina was working with Tristan, and that Brian had had a relationship with her in the past. Things had been strained between them since then, but her heart began to hammer in her chest all the same, and heat flared in her belly, and her pulse rate quickened, and her entire body caught fire, and then Brian suddenly, but gently, pulled his hand from her grasp and leaned back again, and the moment full of whatever it had been full of evaporated. He looked down at his glass and lifted it to his lips, filling his mouth with the dark red wine, savoring it for a moment before swallowing. Nina was still too keyed up and confused by what she was feeling to say anything, so she watched him instead, noting how his strong throat worked over the swallow, feeling warmth spread through her belly as if she were the one who had drunk deeply from her glass. When Brian looked at her again, his expression was bland and unreadable, as if there had been nothing about the last few minutes that was any different from the millions of minutes that had preceded them. As if wanting to emphasize that, he asked a question guaranteed to dispel any strange sensations that might be lingering. So what do you plan to do about your sister? Nina wished she had an answer for all the questions, both spoken and unspoken, that had arisen this evening, but most especially for that one. Her future, at the moment, was shakier and more open than it had ever been before. And she wasn't the sort of person who found the unknown exciting. On the contrary, she couldn't function if she didn't have a thorough, well-thought-out plan. The only plan she had at the moment, though, was to have another sip of her wine. Which she did. She was beginning to discover she liked wine. Then, I don't know, she finally said. I feel like Tristan hired Sabrina under false pretenses, and I don't want her to work for Night Gaming if that's the case. I'd like her to be hired on the merit of her knowledge and potential, not because she's acting as a corporate spy. You could try to talk her into resigning, Brian said. She studied him in silence for a moment, wondering why he'd made the suggestion he had. Was it because he wanted to be proven right? Or was he looking out for Nina's best interests? Or was it simply because he wanted to stick it to Tristan Guidice? Not long ago, she would have assumed it was either the first or last of those reasons. Now, however, she couldn't help thinking maybe he really did want to help Nina do what was best for herself. It will probably be a moot point, she said. If she decides I'm not going to be beneficial to her in the way she first thought, I wouldn't be surprised if she manufactures some excuse to cut ties again. She raised a shoulder and let it drop, hoping the half-shrug hid the turmoil roiling inside her. What was weird was that the turmoil was less a result of the prospect of losing her sister again, and more the result of the way Brian continued to look at her. He dropped his gaze into his glass again, swirling the dark wine around the sides of the bowl. In thoughtful concentration. "Well, if she does decide to resign," he began, "or if Tristan is stupid enough to let her go, I have a position at Guidice Games that needs filling." He glanced up at Nina again, fixing his gaze on hers. "If you think she'd be interested, she'd be perfect for it." For some reason, his offer of giving her sister her old job back didn't rankle her as much as it might have had he made it 2 weeks before. Maybe because this time he wasn't being such an arrogant jackass about it. No, this time, his tone was solicitous, his body language inquisitive. This time, it was indeed an offer, not an order to be on her guard with her sister. "I also meant what I said about working with you, taking you on as an employee, part-time or full-time. Your choice." But Nina was no more interested in accepting it now than she had been before. She still needed more than to be Brian Guidice's assistant. She was too smart and too ambitious, and she wanted to do more with her life and herself. "Brian, I can't just give up my job at the bookstore," she told him. "We've been through this. I need something that will challenge me to be the best that I can be, and I love my job. I worked hard to build that business up and it's important to me." "I'm not offering you a position as my assistant," he told her. "I'm offering you a new one." Nina wasn't sure if she should be suspicious or not. Ultimately, she decided on being cautious. "What kind of position?" He turned toward the deck railing and leaned over to prop his arms on it, then gazed up at the moon as he spoke. "There's no title for it yet. But I'm getting ready to acquire a technology company that's been failing due to mismanagement and carelessness. I'm going to need someone to work side by side with me getting it whipped into shape." Nina told herself not to make anything of his body language, that he was looking at the moon and might be, figuratively anyway, offering her something that didn't exist, and consider what he was saying. "Tell me more about the company," she asked carefully. He did, describing its rise and fall and the problems that had led to its faltering. She nodded as he spoke, turning over in her mind the possibilities and potential, and the various avenues they could take to put the company back on its feet. When Brian finished, she asked, "What's the salary and benefits for this position?" "Quadruple what you'd have made as my assistant," he told her. Her eyebrows shot up at that. That was twice what she earned running her bookstore with partners. "Full medical and dental," he added, "contributions to an IRA and 401(k). And, if you want, we can talk stock options." "I want," she said readily. By now he had straightened again and was lifting his glass to his mouth. But he stopped so abruptly when Nina said what she did that some of the ruby wine spilled over onto his hand. Hastily, he took the glass in his other hand and tried to shake the wine from his fingers, then looked around for something to wipe the rest of it off. Nina snatched a serviette from the table and handed it to him. He set his glass down, wiped his hand clean, then crumpled up the serviette and tossed it back on the table. When he looked at her again, he seemed agitated about something. But all he said was, "Then let's talk." Nina met his gaze levelly. "Okay. I'm listening." The coffee shop where Michael had scheduled their morning meeting, which he deemed unavoidable on a Saturday because Nina's orientation had fallen behind this week. Yeah, Michael, since some people blew off essential dinner meetings to instead chase after breathtaking blondes, was located a couple of blocks away from her house. But it was every bit as quaint and charming as the restaurant he'd taken her to a few weeks back. He'd made a point of keeping in touch with her, and she'd found herself relaxing into the old camaraderie they'd always shared, talking to him about her relationship with Brian, and the shock of bumping into Sabrina. When he'd suggested that they meet, because he had a business proposal for her, Nina had been wary. Michael was a charmer, but he also liked get-rich-quick schemes, and they were dangerous. Still, he'd insisted, and then stood her up the previous night and insisted on meeting this morning. Even though it was early and also Saturday, in case Nina hadn't mentioned that part, there were a number of people out and about, ambling down the walkways, waiting for the shops to open and sipping their morning lattes. But, unlike Nina, who was dressed in her usual business trousers and shirt, in this case beige for the former and cream for the latter, everyone else sported vacation clothes, mostly shorts and t-shirts or loose cotton dresses coupled with sneakers or sandals. Because they, unlike Nina, didn't have to work today. On account of it was Saturday. In case she hadn't mentioned that part. She looked longingly down at her pointy-toed, 3-inch ivory pumps, then at the beat-up Birkenstock sandals on a woman passing by, and she sighed. Someday, she thought, she was going to be the big cheese at her own successful corporation. And the first policy she planned to put in place was a casual Friday. Then she'd add a casual Thursday. And a casual Wednesday, Tuesday and Monday, too. And then she'd decree that no work ever took place on the weekend. She knew her business philosophy was an unconventional one. Most corporate big shots had gotten where they were by working overtime, downtime, double time and time and a half. She knew it was traditional to keep employees towing a conservative line in all things business-related. And she knew power suits made a more imposing impression than beat-up Birkenstock sandals. But she also knew that the real secret to success was loving what you did for a living. And Nina loved big business. She just wasn't that crazy about all its trappings. She didn't think the image was as important as other people did. As far as she was concerned, actions spoke louder than power suits. She would rather have a force of casually dressed, happy, productive employees working for her than she would a bunch of polished corporate drones. It wasn't enough to be smart and energetic in today's business world. Creativity was absolutely essential. And creative people were not a suit-wearing tribe. So Nina was going to cut her workforce a little slack. She toed off one pointy-toed high heel and let it drop to the sidewalk. And she would cut herself some slack, too. Brian hadn't had a title or description yet for the job he'd offered her, but she wasn't worried. No matter what it was, she would do it well. She would play by his rules for as long as it took to get the business off the ground, and then she would tailor it to her policies and procedures and put her own personal stamp on it. Brian, for all his conservative bluster, had always been an open-minded and far-sighted businessman. It was part of what had made him so successful. He would expect Nina to be her own woman with whatever he gave her to direct. And she couldn't wait to get started. As if cued by the thought, Michael Jones turned the corner just then, catching Nina's eye and raising a hand in greeting. He was having a casual Saturday, she noticed, wearing faded jeans with a brightly patterned tiki shirt and, she noted with some wistfulness, sandals. "You didn't have to dress for work," he said by way of a greeting as he sat down across from her. Nina eyed him with what she hoped looked like terseness, since terse was suddenly how she felt. "Well, since we're supposed to be working," she said meaningfully, "I dressed for work." "But it's Saturday," he said with a smile. Then he looked past her and waved to catch a waiter's attention. "You don't have to be all buttoned up and battened down. Live a little." "Yeah, like you did last night, huh, Michael?" Nina had to bite her lip to keep the words from tumbling out. Instead, she was the picture of politeness when she asked, "What happened to you last night?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Last night?" She nodded. "We were supposed to have a dinner meeting to discuss your incredible business proposal and how I can help you." He shook his head. "No, we're doing that this morning." Nina turned her head and tugged lightly on an earring. No, it was supposed to be last night, Michael. In fact, when we said goodbye on the phone yesterday afternoon after our discussion about the deal that you made with one of the subsidiaries I'd be working with, you distinctly said, "I'll see you at 6:30. But I waited 20 minutes, and you never showed." He looked a little taken aback, presumably by her tone, which, she had to admit, wasn't the sort of voice one normally used with a potential business partner. Particularly a brand new one. No, it was more the tone of voice one used with a dog who had just peed on the carpet. His eyes went flinty. Then he smiled, a gesture that fell well short of making him look happy. "I meant 6:30 tonight," he said. "No, you meant Friday," she countered with all confidence. "I don't make mistakes like that." "Neither do I." "You did last night," Nina told him pointedly. "Or maybe you just found yourself preoccupied by a better prospect. A blonde prospect." His smile disappeared, and his eyes hardened even more. "What I do in my private time is none of your business, Nina. It is if it affects my job." He expelled a soft sound of undisguised contempt. "What job?" he demanded. "We haven't even discussed the business." Not that Nina minded, since it would save her the trouble of turning him down and get her out of unwanted commitments more quickly, but she felt compelled to ask, what business exactly? Mostly because she didn't want to leave any loose threads hanging. And, okay, also because she wanted to goad him. "What business?" he asked incredulously. "I don't think that's any of your business now that we're not going to work together, do you? You're also completely unsuited to the position I had you in mind for." Ridiculous, she thought. She was perfect for the job of vice president. And in a few years, once she got her legs, she'd be perfect for the job of CEO. After that, she wasn't sure, but she might take over the universe. At the moment, she felt perfectly capable. She was that confident of her abilities. Evidently, Michael didn't have such an inflated opinion of her, however, because he continued, "You're also withdrawn and uncooperative, and you're not a team player." Nina nodded at this. By his definition of those words, he was right, and she told him so. In other words, I'm ethical to the point that I won't roll over on my boyfriend and tell you all his best kept business secrets. Michael's mouth shut tight at that, but he said nothing. "That's why you contacted me, isn't it, Michael? Because you thought I'd speak freely about Brian Guidice. You thought I'd make you privy to all his personal quirks and habits and reveal the details of any of his dealings that I might have been in on." For a moment, Michael said nothing. Then he sneered at her and said, as if Brian Guidice would allow his mistress to be in on any of his dealings. "I don't know what I was thinking to assume a nobody like you would have any insight into a rival corporation." Nina smiled sweetly. "For one thing, Michael, mistresses are the backbone of any good business. They're not nobodies. For another thing, you're wrong. I know more about Brian's business than Brian does. He'd tell you himself he couldn't operate without me. So much so, that he's offered me a job. An executive position," she added confidently. Even though she was confident of no such thing. Brian had made clear that the job, whatever it was important, essential, valuable. And it was hers, the moment she decided to take it. Which was going to happen more quickly than she initially thought. "You can't turn me down, Michael," she told him as she stood. "I never signed up for anything, and I never will." Much better than signing dodgy deals, she thought. As she slung her purse over her shoulder, she added, "Thanks for the coffee. And the reality check." I assure you both were much appreciated." And then she turned and strode confidently down the sidewalk, back towards her house. She had an unexpected day off, she thought with a smile. Well, okay, maybe not all that unexpected. She'd planned to tell Michael this morning that she wouldn't be coming to work with him on his plans, and she'd been fairly sure he would try to argue with her on the spot. She just thought it would go a little more smoothly, that was all. She truly hadn't meant for things to end as abruptly as they had, or with as much chilliness. But Michael had deliberately skipped their meeting last night, something that had illustrated his disregard for her as both a person and a friend. And he had lured her under false pretenses to begin with. It hadn't exactly been a situation that lent itself to air kisses and toodaloos. If she'd been too pushy or blunt, her steps slowed and her back straightened. She smiled. If she'd been too pushy and blunt, then it just meant she was a solid businesswoman. Any man who'd been pushy and blunt would have been applauded and called assertive and candid. So she was going to applaud herself, too. Boy, what a couple of days for changes and epiphanies, Nina thought. So far, she accepted a new power job, rediscovered her relationship with her sister, told her sleazy ex what a sleazy ex he was, discovered what an assertive businesswoman she was, and now she could go back to her house, and she halted in her tracks, her confidence fleeing completely. Because she realized then that her house didn't feel like her home anymore. She'd spent so much time with Brian at his house, that the lure of hers simply wasn't there anymore. And yet, they still weren't quite on the easy footing they'd been before her sister had shown back up on the scene. She sighed and gave her forehead a good mental smack. So much for being the assertive, candid businesswoman who could take over the universe at will. In a matter of hours, Nina was bereft at the loss of a man she felt she could have a very definite future with, but she had no idea how to go about convincing him of it. What was she going to do? She had no real idea, but she knew she'd have to think of something, and quickly. Otherwise, she might lose him, and she really didn't want to do that. When she arrived back at her house, it was as though the universe had heard her pleas for help, because she found the place flooded, and the ceiling caved in. Her hot water geyser had burst and flooded the attic sometime during the morning, causing the ceiling to give way. Luckily, most of her furniture was spared, but when she called the insurance company, they told her it would take a couple weeks to send someone out, get it assessed and bring contractors in to fix it. There was no way she was spending a couple weeks in a house with no ceiling, and besides, it was the perfect excuse to go and camp out on Brian's doorstep.
Chapter 9. Brian was reading an unexpectedly interesting book on corporate espionage when there was a knock at the door. He set it face down on the sofa and went to answer, automatically brushing the dust from his jeans and pinstriped, untucked Oxford, even though the house wasn't old enough to have accumulated any dust, and even though, if it did, his housekeeper would have made short work of it. He thought that it was probably Jen or Tristan at the door, and why that realization made Brian's mouth turn down in consternation, he couldn't have said. But his mouth turned up again when he opened the front door, and his step felt lighter, even if he was standing still, when he saw that it wasn't his brother or sister who stood on the other side, but Nina. Her appearance surprised him. Not so much her appearance on his doorstep, but rather her appearance on his doorstep. She was dressed in the kind of thing he'd never seen her wear before: blue jeans that were faded to the point of being torn in places, and a pale blue t-shirt that was brief enough to allow a glimpse of smooth flesh between its hem and the waistband of her jeans. Even more surprising than Nina's appearance, however, was her luggage's appearance, since, by virtue of its appearance, it was apparent that it would be visiting, too. It was scattered about her feet in a way that made it look as if she'd just dropped it there in frustration before ringing the bell. She sounded frustrated, too, when she said, by way of a greeting, "Can I ask you a favor?" Brian tried to tear his gaze away from that very alluring strip of naked flesh and failed. Miserably. Still gazing at the hem of her shirt, he mentally willed it to leap up again the way it had all too briefly when she'd shoved her hands into her back pockets. and somehow he conjured the presence of mind to reply to her question. Unfortunately, that reply was a very distracted, "Huh." She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, an action which, although not the one he was mentally willing her to complete, nevertheless had the desired result. For another scant second, that band of naked flesh widened, causing the heavens to open up and a chorus of angels to sing, "Hallelujah! Hooah! Can I ask you a favor?" Nina said again, but she said it without moving her body, unfortunately, so her shirt stayed in place. Then again, that at least allowed Brian to be coherent enough to answer her question this time. Kind of. At least he got out an hum that sounded vaguely affirmative in nature. The problem was, by then, he couldn't remember what the question was that he was answering. His reply seemed to be fine for Nina, though, because she continued, "Would it be possible for me to crash here for a couple of days?" The question was unexpected enough to command a much larger chunk of his attention. So unexpected, in fact, that he wouldn't have been more surprised if Nina had just asked him if it would be possible for him to pull the Empire State Building out of his pocket. Then, again, the way he was beginning to feel watching the comings and goings of her shirt tail, that might not be such an unreasonable request in a few more minutes. He managed to cover his reaction well, though he hoped, and through some Herculean effort, he also managed to bring his gaze back up to her face. "Problems at home?" he asked. She nodded her head. "Problems with all sorts of things." Hey, that sounded promising, he thought. What kind of problems? "My meeting with Michael was a complete failure. He wanted to use me to find info on you, and when I didn't give, he lost his temper. He was wrong. That wasn't promising. It was perfect." Before he could say anything more, she hurried on. "But while I was meeting with him to discuss our options, the geyser at home burst and flooded my house. It's in complete shambles. I don't know when it will be fixed, and I don't feel like living in a damp house without a ceiling for the next couple weeks. Would you mind if I stayed here?" Thank God for small favors, Brian thought. Inescapably, his gaze had dropped to her midsection again when he'd noticed, how could he miss it, that as Nina had spoken, she had used a lot of hand gestures, and the hem of her little t-shirt rose and fell with every one, once even high enough to allow him a peek at a truly spectacular navel. So spectacular, in fact, that he enjoyed a quick impression of dragging a line of open-mouthed kisses across her flat abdomen before dipping his tongue into the elegant little cleft for a taste. Until he remembered it was Nina's navel he was tasting in his fantasy. Nina, he reminded himself emphatically. This was Nina he was thinking about, for God's sake. Nina's midsection, and Nina's navel. All of them were strictly off limits because she was Nina, Brian told himself. That was why. He'd offered her a job and was trying to help her reconcile with her sister. She had the potential to become a trusted employee. He didn't want to compromise with some kind of messy workplace involvement. A trusted employee with an excellent work record. A trusted employee with strong business ethics and sound professional judgment. A trusted employee with long dark braided hair that was tumbling free around her shoulders in a way that made him want to reach out and touch it. A trusted employee with enormous brown eyes a man could drown in. A trusted employee with a luscious navel he really, really wanted to taste. So if the offer of that new position is still open, his luscious, tasty, trusted employee said, "Now, I'd like to come and work for you, on the condition that my job at the bookstore not be compromised." The word that should have registered most in that sentence was work. But Brian's brain had gotten so caught up on position that it never quite made the leap to work. And the position that came to mind just then, although it definitely involved Nina, had absolutely nothing to do with work. Well, okay, maybe there would have to be a little work involved. It was kind of an unusual position. But that work would have definitely been a labor of low lust, he hastily corrected himself. A labor of lust. Brian. His name, spoken in her voice, a voice so rife with concern, made him push the thoughts out of his head completely. "What?" he asked. She eyed him curiously. "Is everything okay?" He nodded. "Yeah, fine," he said with some distraction. I was reading when you rang the bell, and I guess my mind just hasn't caught up with the rest of me. Actually, that wasn't true, he knew. His mind had not only caught up, it had raced right past him and was now in an entirely different time zone. The naval zone, where time moved at a totally different pace than it did in the rest of the world. So is it okay if I crash here for a couple of days? She asked again. I had to contact my insurance to find out about an assessment and quote, and they can't get one out until Monday. I tried to find a room at another hotel, but all the good ones are booked solid, and dash. It's fine, Nina, he interrupted her. Of course you can stay here. There's plenty of room. Though the minute he said that, somehow, for some reason, the huge house suddenly felt very crowded. Thanks, she said, breathing a sigh of unmistakable relief. She bent to retrieve her bags, but Brian intercepted her, scooping up all three before she had the chance. When he looked at her again, he could tell she was surprised by the gesture. Or maybe it was just that she was usually the one doing things for him, not the other way around. It hit Brian then like a 2x4 to the back of the head. How very true that was. In the short time that he'd known her, Nina had done so many things for him to keep him on track. Granted, he hadn't asked her to do any of it, but still. What had he ever done for her in return, other than take her out for dinner and buy her a book stand? Yeah, there hadn't been time to do the things he'd wanted to spoil her with, like chocolates for her birthday every year and the gourmet food baskets every Christmas. But those would likely have been things he'd have his secretary order for her, and he wouldn't even have picked them out himself. Then again, Nina had never seemed to expect anything more, he told himself. But that was no excuse for not showing his appreciation more often. Note to self, Guidice, show Nina a little appreciation this time around. As a reluctant afterthought, he made himself add, and appreciate something besides her navel. It would be a tough job, but he was pretty sure he could do it. She followed him up to the second floor where Brian had a choice of guest rooms in which to house her. Not asking himself why he did it, he made his way immediately to one, near the master bedroom where he was sleeping himself. The room was furnished in varying shades of green and gold, the stout four-poster covered with a lightweight patchwork quilt, the hardwood floors broken up here and there with rag rugs. It was what Brian had come to think of as the rustic room, though it was every bit as luxurious as the rest of the house. The wide windows opened onto a thick patch of pine trees, beyond which was a spectacular view with a finger of lake on one side. At night, he thought, she could do what he'd been doing, lie in bed and listen to the wind gliding through the trees, and wait for the melancholy hoot, hoot, hoot of a solitary owl. Hey, it wasn't as if there was much else to do around the house at night. At least there hadn't been before. Why don't you stay more than a couple of days? He asked impulsively as he tossed Nina's bags onto the bed. When he turned, he saw that she had stopped in the doorway, and she didn't look as if she planned on coming in anytime soon. I mean, you don't have any obligations at the moment, he pointed out unnecessarily. And I'm not going to be coming back to the office for a few more weeks. I don't expect you to report to the office before I get back myself. When was the last time you took a vacation? She threw him a funny look. I just had one. 2 weeks between finding my sister and learning about Michael's attempts to get into Guidice gaming. Oh, right. Well, what did you do during those 2 weeks? He asked. I bet you didn't. Spend them out of town, did you? No, she admitted. I did some work around my house that I'd been putting off for a while. Well, there you go, Brian said. You need a vacation. I have a vacation home. At least it would be a vacation home for you. She crossed her arms over her midsection and dropped her weight to 1 foot. And besides, she said, you brought a lot of work with you from the office, and you could use someone to help out with it while you're here, right? He gaped at her, shocked that she could think such a thing of him. What shocked him even more was that what she just accused him of had never once crossed his mind. Of course not, he denied. Yeah, I brought work with me, but I'm getting it done just fine by myself. Well, except for the fact that he couldn't stop thinking about Nina and what she did to him, and how worried he was that she might decide to break things off because of his past with her sister. Jen had told him he was being silly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow important to her. It didn't make sense. And it left him an insecure mess that was contrary to everything he'd ever felt about a woman before. She smiled at him in a way that made him think she knew exactly what kind of problems he was having. Then she surprised him by saying, "Okay, I'll stay a couple more days. It is a beautiful place, and I could use some downtime." Brian wasn't sure what to make of the ripple of pleasure that wound through him at her acceptance of his invitation, so he decided not to question it. In fact, he decided not to think about it at all, because Nina's smile grew broader then, and she crossed her arms in a way that made her little t-shirt ride up on her torso again, giving him another delicious glimpse at that navel. The ripple of pleasure turned into a raging tsunami at that, and he was suddenly overcome by the absolute conviction that his life would never get better than it was in that moment, standing in the same room with Nina and her navel, knowing she would be around for a few more days. But he was wrong, because what she said to him after that multiplied his pleasure tenfold and nearly sent his body into paroxysms of ecstasy. Because what she said then was, I need to run into town to pick up a few things. Why don't we see if we can find the ingredients for a strawberry chocolate cake, and I'll bake one for you." That was when Brian knew, without doubt, that Nina Jacobs was the only woman in the world who would ever be able to make him happy. "But, Brian," she added, more soberly this time, "you have to promise me you won't do anything with the cake except eat it the way I ask you to." He narrowed his eyes in confusion. "What way will that be?" "You'll see. Trust me." Strangely, he realized he already did. Implicitly, though, thinking back on their history together, maybe that wasn't so strange after all. What was strange was that, suddenly, for some reason, he realized he also trusted Nina in ways that went beyond just lust. But what was strangest of all was that he found himself wanting her to trust him, too, in ways that had nothing to do with the bedroom. "Come on," she said. "You'll have to drive. Let's pick up some groceries, too. I'm tired of restaurant food and carryout. Let's cook tonight."
Chapter 10. They weren't able to find the ingredients for chocolate strawberry cake, but with a mischievous grin, Nina threw some whipped cream into the basket. They did lots of other things there, shared a banana split at the ice cream parlor, played air hockey at the arcade, selected fresh produce at the farmer's market, and enjoyed a late afternoon beer at the pub, but the little community market was fresh out of strawberries by the time they arrived. Interestingly, Brian wasn't even halfway through the banana split when he forgot all about it. And when Nina made mention of it again halfway through the afternoon beer, he had to take a minute to remember that, oh, yeah, that was one of the reasons they'd gone into town, wasn't it? Because by then, he was enjoying himself so much with Nina that he couldn't even remember why strawberries had been important in the first place. Nor could he remember the last time he'd played air hockey. Probably because he had played with Tristan, and it had probably been one of those death matches the two of them never seemed able to avoid. With Nina, they hadn't even kept score. Brian couldn't remember the last time he had a banana split either, and he'd certainly never shared one before, thanks to the I got mine mentality he'd grown up with under his father's misguided tutelage. Even the afternoon beer was unusual for Brian. He never took time out of his day to engage in things that had no purpose other than to make the day a little nicer. And the thing was, the day would have been nicer even without all those things, simply because Nina was a part of it. Why had he never realized before how much he liked having her around? He wondered as they drove back to his house, chatting amiably the whole way. She'd been with him for 5 months, and not once had it occurred to him that the reason his life was as good as it was due in large part to Nina's simple presence in it. All that time, he'd thought he valued her for her efficiency and organizational skills. It was only after she'd left that he'd realized she'd brought so much more to his life. He liked Nina. He liked her a lot. Not just as an employee, but as a person. As a friend. As a companion. The two of them had an easy camaraderie with each other after such a short time that he hadn't even realized had developed. A give and take, an ebb and flow, an itch and scratch that was as well orchestrated and choreographed as a Broadway show. And now he understood that camaraderie transcended their working relationship. Today, they'd enjoyed an ease of conversation Brian didn't share with people he'd known twice as long as Nina. And that night, out on the terrace with Nina at his house, in his bed. That had been one of the most enjoyable evenings he'd ever had. Even as they unpacked and put away their groceries, they spoke easily and moved in concert with each other as if they did this all the time. The preparation of dinner, too, was another perfectly executed team effort, as was the cleaning up afterward. As Brian opened a second bottle of wine, Nina reached into the cupboard for 2 fresh glasses. As he poured, she dimmed the lights, and, together, they retreated to the house's lush living room. The sun was setting over the mountains, leaving the lake midnight blue and smooth as silk. Brian watched Nina head for a lamp, then hesitate before turning it on. He understood. The lighting outside this time of evening was just too beautiful not to appreciate. When she moved to the massive windows to look out on the vista, he joined her. But it wasn't the lake and mountains that drew his eye. It was Nina's expression as she looked at them, all soft and mellow and contented. The way he felt himself. "This place is truly gorgeous," she said. He nodded, still looking at her. "Gorgeous," he echoed. "I can't believe you actually live in a place this beautiful." "Yeah, pity about the fact that I turned out to be a man just like my father." "And what kind of men did he happen to turn out to be?" she asked. Brian inhaled a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Men who are too busy building our empires to remember why we wanted to build them in the first place. Men who work so hard. We've forgotten how to live." But he realized as he said it that hadn't been true of him today. Today, Brian had forgotten all about work. Today, he'd forgotten all about empires. Today, he'd thought only about Nina. And today, more than any other day of his life, he had lived. He'd lived, and he'd enjoyed living. He'd enjoyed it a lot. More, even, than work. From the corner of his eye, he saw Nina turn toward him, but he continued to gaze out the window, looking for something. He wasn't sure what. "You miss him, don't you?" she said softly. He nodded. It happened so quickly. By the time the doctors found the cancer, it was too late to do anything to save him. "It must have been hard on you and Jen and Tristan." Hard wasn't the word, Brian thought. Devastating, he said instead. "It tore us apart, in more ways than one." Jen was the one who kept us all together, but Dad's will drove a wedge between me and Tristan so big that I don't know if we'll ever mend it. "Jen keeps us together now." "What?" Nina asked. "I thought you guys didn't get along." "We don't." "Didn't," he immediately corrected himself. "But in college, we did. Somehow." Jen made us see past all the animosity and one-upmanship our father generated in us. Tristan and I were friends, real friends, in college. But after Dad died, he didn't continue. What had happened to Brian and Tristan was complicated and unsettled. And he didn't want to talk about anything complicated or unsettling tonight. So he only said, "We all drifted apart after college. We all did well, at least professionally. But we lost each other." He did turn to look at Nina then. "Until now," he said, smiling. "Somehow, your reconciliation with Sabrina has led to Tristan reaching out to me. I'm not sure how, but maybe she had a hold on him that I didn't realize. A way to influence him. He's asked me to meet them for dinner. Him and Jen and Sabrina, although he had no idea what possessed him to do it. Brian added, "Would you like to come back with me for that?" Her eyes widened in surprise at the invitation. And truth be told, Brian was surprised he'd extended it. But once said, it seemed perfectly natural. Perfectly normal. Something about having Nina there with his brother as they tried to mend the past, the people who had always been more important to Brian than anyone else, felt right. She nodded slowly, smiling. "I'd love to come," she said. "It would be nice to spend time with Jen again. And Sabrina. And your brother, too." Brian wasn't sure why he did what he did next. Something about the moment, about the house, about the woman, just made it feel right. Dipping his head toward Nina's, he covered her mouth with his and kissed her. Lightly at first, gently, a part of him fearing she might pull away. But she didn't pull away. She tilted her head to the side a little, to make it easier for him, and then she kissed him back. Slowly, sweetly, almost as if she'd been expecting it, and as if she wondered what had taken him so long.
Hi again. Unfortunately, there was another adult scene here which we've had to take out.
If you're a member of Romancely Audio Velvet, you can log in and hear it now. The love scene references Her Alpha CEO, Chapter 10, Love Scene 4.
If you're not yet a Romancely Audio Velvet member, check the description to join now. Okay, back to the story.
For long moments, they only kissed and touched each other, their pulse rates and respiration multiplying with every one that passed. When they finally started moving slowly, deliberately, carefully, Nina wasn't sure if it was she or Brian who was responsible. Somehow, though, they kissed and touched and danced their way across the living room, through the door and up the stairs, until they stood in the upstairs hallway, surrounded by bedrooms. Surrounded by choices. Only then did Brian pull back, as if he wanted to give her time to make whatever choice she was going to make. His hesitation surprised her. Usually, he was a man who, when he wanted something, did whatever he had to do to get it. No cajoling, no seducing, no petitioning, only full-on frontal attack, damn the torpedoes or anything that got in his way. She wouldn't have been surprised if he had swept her up at the bottom of the stairs the way Rhett had Scarlett and carried her to his room to ravish her. Especially since she'd made it clear how very much she wanted to be ravished. Evidently, though, Brian pursued his personal affairs with more finesse than he did his professional ones. And for some reason, realizing that just made Nina that much more certain that allowing this next step between them, however suddenly it had come though. Somehow, it didn't feel that sudden at all, was the right thing to do.
Oh no, it's about to get hot.
But we can't put this on YouTube as they don't allow it. I'm sorry.
But check the description of this video to join Romancely Audio Velvet and get the steamy scenes in future.
If you're already a member, the love scene references Her Alpha CEO, Chapter 10, Love Scene 5.
Okay, back to the story.
It was then that Nina's confidence about what she had allowed to happen between them began to slip. Because she realized then that what she had thought was a crush on a sexy man was so much more. And although Brian had certainly mellowed during his time with her, to the point where he no longer seemed consumed by his work, he'd offered no indication that he considered anything else more important. Maybe he wasn't anymore. Maybe. But would he ever join himself to someone else?
Chapter 11. Nina woke slowly, not sure at first where she was. The sun wasn't up yet, but there was an indistinct golden glow dancing at the foot of her bed whose origin she couldn't quite figure out, so groggy was she from sleep. She felt blissfully happy for no reason she could name and snuggled more deeply into the covers. Why was her bed so much more comfortable than usual? She wondered blearily as she pulled the covers higher. So much warmer? So much more welcome? And why did she want nothing more than to stay here like this forever? Usually, the moment she awoke, completely, then immediately shoved back the covers and rose to face the day. She was even one of those people who immediately made the bed. So finished with it was she until nightfall came again. But today, she sighed deeply, purring a little as she exhaled. Today, she just wanted to stay in bed until nightfall came again. Because something about the prospect of nightfall coming once more made a shudder of delight wind through her. She was about to sigh again when her brain finally started to function, albeit none too quickly. It did get enough momentum going for her to finally realize what the light at the foot of the bed could be. Fire. Her bedroom was on fire. She jackknifed up to a sitting position, prepared to flee for her life, then was shocked to discover she was naked. Why was she naked? In moving so hastily, she jostled the person next to her. Why was there another person in her bed, who, with a muffled groan, turned over and, with a muffled thump, landed on the floor? And she realized there was something very familiar about that groan. That, finally, was when Nina remembered. She wasn't in her bed. She wasn't in her house. The fire in the room was the light of candles. It was perfectly safe, perfectly lovely, perfectly romantic. And the reason she felt so good was because, so that was why there was someone else in the bed. She felt more than saw Brian throw an arm up onto the mattress, but she definitely heard another soft groan as he pulled himself up off the floor. Then she heard a sound of exasperation as he crawled back into bed beside her. And then, in a voice full of concern, he asked, "What's wrong?" Oh, there were so many ways she could answer that question. Too many ways. And even so, none of them seemed quite right. Going to bed with Brian last night had been the wrong thing to do, Nina told herself. He was her prospective employer again, and she was too smart to get involved with an office romance. But being in bed with Brian this morning felt so wonderfully right. She would have been an idiot not to make love with the man last night, feeling the way she did about him. Okay, then, her feelings for him were wrong, she told herself. Falling in love with her future boss? How stupid could she be? But then, only a brainless ninny would be immune to a man like him. How could she not love him? And that was when it hit her full force. She was in love with Brian. Probably had been for weeks. She just hadn't let herself admit it, because she'd been convinced he would never love her in return. And maybe he didn't love her, she thought, just because they'd made love more than once with utter abandon and not a little creativity. Oh God, she thought. Nina had no idea what to think just then, so she did the only thing she could do. She lied. Nothing, she said, hoping Brian didn't detect the note of alarm she heard in her voice. Nothing's wrong. Everything's wonderful, fabulous, marvelous, stupendous. Couldn't be better. In fact, everything is so perfect that I want to leave right now, before anything happens to change it. I'll see myself out. Call me when you get back to work. Goodbye. Okay, so she lied and panicked. It was a perfectly justifiable response. Thankful for the darkness, she shoved the covers aside and started to rise from the bed, until Brian clapped a strong hand around her wrist and pulled her back down again. Then he levered his body over hers and kissed her. Hard, long, deep, and then some of the tension in Nina's body began to drain away. Oh, all right, all the tension in her body drained away. In fact, by the time Brian raised his head, she was pretty sure it was going to be hours before she moved again. Unless, he kissed her like that a second time, in which case she would probably start moving a lot. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice a velvet purr in the darkness. Not sure she could get her tongue to work, well, not for talking anyway, she only murmured, Good, he said, because we're not even close to being finished. Oh my, Nina thought. He chuckled softly. First we have to have breakfast. Oh, Nina thought. Breakfast, right? And I'm in the mood for something light, delectable, and sweet. Nina was in the mood for something dark, delectable, and spicy. They were going to need a smorgasbord for this. No, she immediately told herself. They weren't going to have a smorgasbord. In fact, they couldn't have breakfast at all. They probably never should have had dinner last night, or the dessert that had come after, or the dessert after that either. She found her voice and softly said, Brian, we need to talk. He rubbed her arm and said, No, we need to not talk. When he started to lean down to kiss her again, she opened her hand lightly over his chest and held firm. Less softly this time, she repeated, Brian, we need to talk. Nina, Brian. He expelled a quiet sound of resolution, then rolled back over to his side of the bed. Enough light flickered from the candles to enable her to make out his expression. But where she might have expected him to be annoyed or unhappy, or even angry at her having halted his advance, instead, he looked kind of dejected. Dejected, she marveled. Brian Guidice. He'd never looked dejected about anything, because he'd never been dejected about anything. Then the look was gone and she told herself she must have just imagined it. What do we need to talk about? He asked, sounding kind of dejected. No, annoyed, she told herself. He must be feeling annoyed that, instead of romping in the sheets a while longer, she wanted to do some girly girl thing like talk about their feelings. But she needed to know how Brian felt, especially since she understood how she felt herself. Inhaling a deep breath, she said very carefully, What exactly happened here tonight? He hesitated a moment before answering, as if he were trying to be careful in choosing his words. Well, he began. First we had a very enjoyable day in town and then we came back here. Actually, Nina hadn't intended to go back quite that far, but he seemed to need to stall for a little more time, so she let him off the hook. Hey, it wasn't as though she knew exactly what to say, in spite of being the one who said they needed to talk. Then we fixed a great meal here, with a very nice Cabernet, in which they'd probably overindulged. She couldn't help thinking. And then we went into the living room and looked out at the lake, he continued. And then, you kissed me. No, you kissed me, she corrected him. And then we kissed. He went on as if she hadn't spoken. And then we came up to the bedroom and had sex. She was about to say something in response to that, when he continued. Then we got hungry and went downstairs to have a snack. Only we stopped in the hallway to, have an appetizer. Nina opened her mouth to speak, but Brian continued. And then we had another appetizer on the landing, and then on the stairs, and then on the living room floor. She started to talk again, but he went on. And then we had a snack and came back upstairs, and had sex in the bed again. And then we slept, and then we woke up, and now we're talking. Can we do something else now? Something I want to do? Like have sex? By the time he finished, Nina was only half listening, because she'd heard what she'd wanted, or at least needed, to hear halfway through. So then it was all just sex? She asked. When he hesitated again, she studied his face closely, wishing the light were better, because no matter what he said next, she wouldn't know if it was true or not unless she could look him in the eye. One thing she'd learned working closely with Brian for 5 months was how to tell when he was being serious or when he was bluffing. But if she couldn't see his face, "What do you mean just sex?" he asked in a voice that was void of any emotion at all. Something that bothered Nina even more than it would have bothered her had it been filled with something, even annoyance. At least then she would have known it meant something to him. Sex isn't a just thing. Sex is a spectacular thing. And we had some pretty spectacular sex, Nina. To reduce it to a cliché, wasn't it good for you, too? Oh, it had been more than good, she thought. It had been more than spectacular. Because to her, it had been special. Brian, she feared, felt differently. And Nina felt, well, she felt different, too. That was what falling in love did to a person. It made them feel different. About everything. Remembering he'd asked her a question that needed an answer. And without thinking, she told him, "It was nice." "Nice?" he echoed incredulously. "Nina, my great-aunt Bridget is nice. The Beaujolais Nouveau last year were nice. Raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens are nice. Sex with Brian Guidice? That's not nice. That's phenomenal." In spite of the way she was feeling inside, Nina smiled. Then, unable to help herself, she reached over and cupped his jaw in her palm. "You were wonderful," she told him. "Phenomenal," he corrected her. "Phenomenal," she repeated dutifully. He had been phenomenal, she thought, but she still didn't know if he was in love. So she turned the conversation to a topic she knew he would understand. Brian, she said carefully, have you come up with a title for the new position I'll be filling at Guidice Games? It wasn't as strange a question as it may have seemed. He wasn't accustomed to talking about his feelings. Although she was confident that he did indeed have feelings for her, she wasn't sure if they mirrored hers for him. Asking Brian how he felt in that moment would only make him clam up. Asking him about work, on the other hand, would make him talk. After such a short time with him, Nina had learned to read the subtleties of his business speak. Brian's reply to the question she just asked would tell her infinitely more than the one to "How do you feel?" would tell her. That's kind of a strange question to ask right now, isn't it? He asked. I mean, aren't you going to ask me how I feel? She shook her head. I want to hear about the new position. Details this time. Not vague promises. He expelled a soft sound of resignation, but replied, Actually, I still haven't come up with a title. She nodded slowly, her heart sinking a little. Okay, then what does the new position involve? He hesitated a telling moment, then said, It's really going to challenge you. The responsibilities are awesome. There will be days when you meet yourself coming and going. Well, that certainly sounded vague. Such as? She asked. Well, your day will begin early, he told her. I'll expect you at the office by 7:30. Brian, that was the time I arrived at any of my other jobs. It's not a problem. And she couldn't help thinking a little sadly, it wasn't very awesome either. Right, he said. Of course. A typical day for you at this new job will consist of a lot of different things, he continued. Lots of responsibilities. Awesome responsibilities. Her heart sank more. So you've said, you think you're smarter than me and more essential than me and more valuable than me. But here's a news flash for you. Everyone's important in some way or another. Everyone's got smarts of one kind or another. Everyone's essential in some capacity. And everyone's valuable, too. She inhaled a deep breath and finished, I'm valuable, Brian, for more than getting you coffee and tidying your desk and planning your parties. I can make as big a mark on the world as you have. And I will. Just watch me.
Chapter 12. Brian felt panic well up inside him when he realized Nina was going to leave. Really? Leave this time. Not just her job, but him. And this time there would be no convincing her to come back. How could she think her job wasn't important? The work she did was crucial. And how could she think he didn't consider her valuable? She meant more to him than anything. Anything. And that was when it hit him. It wasn't that he needed Nina as his assistant to keep him on track. And it wasn't that he needed her as his assistant to be successful. And it wasn't that he needed her as his assistant to make him happy. He just needed Nina. Period. In his work, in his life, in his heart. Nina, wait, he said as she pushed back the covers and scrambled out of bed. But she ignored him, jerking the top sheet from the mattress and wrapping it around herself with an awkward sort of fury that generated a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. After everything they'd enjoyed last night, after everything they'd discovered, she wanted to cover herself up now. She wanted to get away from him. She wanted to leave. Nina, you don't understand, he added as he rose from the bed, too. He grabbed his navy silk bathrobe from the back of the bedroom door as he followed her into the hall. Oh, I understand perfectly, she snapped as she went into the guest room where the bags she hadn't even unpacked still lay on the bed. Good God, Brian thought. She didn't even have to pack her bags. All she had to do was get dressed, and she'd be out of there. He had mere minutes before she was gone for good. No, you don't, he told her. You can't understand, because I just figured it out myself. She spun around so quickly, her hair flew over her face. Brushing it fiercely aside with one hand, her other tightened where she clutched the sheet until her knuckles were white. Her entire body quivered with her anger, he noted. Or maybe it was with something else. Maybe it was the same thing that was making his body shudder, too. The realization that he just found something wonderful, the most wonderful, stupendous, spectacular thing in the world, and were about to lose it, before he even had a taste. Finally, coldly, she said, "What, Brian? What don't I understand?" He opened his mouth to try and explain, to try and put into words, as eloquently as he could, all the things he needed to tell her. How much she'd come to mean to him. Not as an employee, but as a woman. How he couldn't live without her. Not because she helped him work better, but because she helped him live better. How he couldn't get through another day without her. Not because she knew how to work his smartphone, but because she knew how to fill all the places inside him he thought would be empty forever. But all he could think to tell her was, "I love you." She went completely still at that. But her fingers on the sheet relaxed, and her expression softened. "What?" she said, her voice a scant whisper. "I love you," he said again. She stiffened once more. "Don't you dare say something like that just because you're trying to." "I mean it, Nina," he said. "I may be heartless when it comes to getting my way in business, but I would never put my heart on the line like this unless I was telling the truth." He took a few experimental steps into the room, taking courage in the fact that she didn't back away from him. But neither did she reach out to him. Nor did she say a word. "I thought I needed you to come back as my assistant, because I thought that was why you were good for me." She frowned at that, so he hurried on, "You know me, Nina. I've always been married to my business. It never occurred to me that anything else could make me happy. I'm an idiot," he admitted. "But I'm not so stupid that I can't learn. And I finally realize, it doesn't matter what job you do, whether you program my smartphone or mop the floors at Guidice Games or come aboard as my new VP in charge of public relations." She narrowed her eyes at him. "What are you talking about? You have a VP in charge of public relations. And I thought you mentioned putting Les in charge of that." "Yeah, well, Les' wife is pregnant with twins, and he wants to be a stay-at-home dad, so he's leaving at the end of August. I was going to hire a headhunter to find someone to fill the position, but I think I already have the perfect candidate looking to come aboard at Guidice Games." Her expression was cautious. "Who?" Did she really have to ask? Well, okay, he supposed she did, since she had asked. "You," he told her. "I'd like you to come work for me as my new VP." She said nothing in response to his offer, something he wasn't sure was good or bad. So, thinking, what the hell, he decided to go for broke. "There's just one problem," he told her. Now her expression turned wary. "What's that?" Guidice Games has a policy that bars spouses from working together. Her eyes widened at that. "Fortunately," he added, "it's just a policy, not written in stone anywhere. Besides which, I'm the CEO, so I can do whatever the hell I want. Should, you know, two of the executives want to get married." It occurred to Brian then that Nina had never actually said she loved him, too. Not that he wasn't pretty sure she at least had some feelings for him. He just wasn't sure if they were as strong as his were for her. "You really want to marry me?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes. I do." "You really love me?" He nodded again. "More than anything." This time, she nodded, too. But it was a slow nod. A thoughtful nod. The kind that indicated she was thinking, not agreeing. Finally, though, she told him, then I think, Brian, before we go any further with this, we need to talk about the terms. Good businesswoman that she was, she insisted they be dressed for their discussion. Conceding the point, Brian decided they should also have access to coffee. So after dressing and having breakfast, he and Nina took their coffee out to the deck, where a warm summer breeze skidded off the lake, and where the golden sun washed over them. They took their seats on the big Adirondack love seat, settling comfortably into the patterned cushions. Brian took solace in the fact that Nina sat close enough to touch him, tucking her bare foot under her denim-clad leg comfortably. Her white cotton shirt was embroidered with white flowers and edged with lace, feminine enough to be unprofessional, another good sign. He, too, was barefoot, his blue jeans as worn as hers, his polo an old, lovingly faded green one that was his favorite for those few occasions when he kicked back and relaxed. They were talking terms, he thought, but for something much more important than business. "Where would you like to start?" he asked. She sipped her coffee and gazed out at the lake. "It occurs to me that if I agree to this merger, it's not the first time you've attempted this kind of thing. And I want to be clear that, although I'm not the first candidate for the position you've offered me, I'm your first, your only choice." He looked at her, confused. "I'm not sure I follow." She sighed, then turned to face him. 2 words. "My sister." He smiled a little self-deprecatingly. "Aw. I guess that's my signal to tell you about my botched wedding attempt, isn't it?" Nina nodded. "I tried to be subtle, but you men just don't have the subtlety gene." He nodded. "That explains a lot, actually. Like how my engagement happened in the first place." He looked at Nina, who had placed her hand on the seat cushion between them, so that her thumb touched her own thigh and her pinky touched his. Her eyes glistened in the morning light, the sun flickered in her hair, first orange then red then gold, and her face lifted into the warm breeze. Her entire being seemed illuminated from within, as if it were she, not the sun, that brought warmth to the day. And to Brian, too. Because he'd sat in the sunshine plenty of times, but never had he felt the way he did in that moment. As if everything in his life that had come before it was only preparation for this moment. As if this moment signified the beginning of something new and wonderful that would last forever. How could he have missed Nina's beauty all those years? He wondered. How could he have missed Nina? How could he have not seen what should have been obvious from the first? That she was a rare, exquisite jewel amid the meaningless rubbish of his work. How could he have thought his work was the most important thing in the world, when every day she was with him was a sign of how there was so much more? "Brian," she said softly. He lifted a hand to thread his fingers through her hair, then hesitated, in case she didn't want him to. But she leaned her head forward, toward his fingers, toward him, and he closed what was left of the distance gratefully, loving the way the soft braids felt cascading over his fingertips. He replied absently. "The engagement?" she prodded gently. "You were going to tell me why it happened." "Right." He had been planning to tell her about his now defunct engagement. Which was weird, because there was another engagement he wanted to talk about so much more. Of course, that engagement hadn't happened yet. So maybe it would be best to divest himself completely of the old one. Then he could move ahead to the new. "It was actually Sabrina's idea," he began. "We were talking about gaming and how her business as a writer was so suited to development in gaming companies over dinner one night, and when the food came, the conversation turned to more personal subject matter, because it's hard to talk business when you're eating." He adopted his best professor voice as he added, importantly, because as everyone knows, it's an unwritten rule of business etiquette that you should never talk about important things with your mouth full. So talk about unimportant things with your mouth full instead. Nina chuckled at that. "Yeah, personal matters are so much less important than professional ones." He nodded. You learned well at my knee, grasshopper. Unfortunately, a lot of what I taught you was wrong. She smiled at that. As long as you understand that now. Oh, I understand a lot now that I was clueless about before. She lifted her hand and cupped his cheek affectionately. A very good sign. We can talk about that, too, she said. In fact, I look forward to it. But first, you're talking to Sabrina. Right. Sabrina mentioned that she was in the market for a permanent position and that a business arrangement would suit her perfectly. Brian nodded. She claimed she'd gotten used to being swindled by businessmen and a permanent contract would be best. And how did she convince you of that? Nina asked. Somehow, I've never pictured you as the sort to mistrust your own judgment. Too true, he said. Except that, like so many other things, he'd been wrong about that, too. His judgment, at least when it came to matters of the heart, stank. Or, at least, it used to. But your sister can be quite a persuasive woman, and she made some excellent points about why it would be beneficial to merge our relationship as well as our work. And since I'd never planned to marry, marrying Sabrina made sense. Whoa, Nina said. I don't follow that logic at all. Of course not, he said. You don't have the convoluted logic gene that men have. Ah. The convoluted logic goes like this, he told her, smiling. Try to keep up. I'd never planned to marry, because I never planned to fall in love. Something else he'd been wrong about, he thought. Man. Where had he ever gotten the idea that he was savvy? So marrying for love made no sense to me. Marrying for business, however. Now Nina nodded. Right. Got it. It's all coming clear now. Anything done for the sake of one's business makes perfect sense. It used to, he said. Back before I realized what was really important. I guess I just never really thought marriage was such a big deal. And when I did think about it, it seemed like the things that screwed up a marriage always resulted from the emotional investment people made in it. I concluded that by not investing emotionally, my marriage to Sabrina would be successful. As long as she and I looked at it pragmatically, everything would be fine. And what did Sabrina think? At that point, she agreed with me. Like I said, she'd been engaged 3 times because she thought she'd been in love, and all 3 times, she ended up abandoned. She hadn't wanted the arrangement to be based on love any more than I had. Until she came to her senses one day and realized how unrealistic she and I both were being about it. And until she met up with your brother, Tristan. Brian waited for the stab of something that should have come with the comment. A stab of jealousy maybe, even if he hadn't been in love with Sabrina when Tristan set out to seduce her. Or a stab of anger that his brother, even though the two of them had barely been speaking at the time, would deliberately seduce his brother's bride. Or even a stab of resentment that Tristan had won some misguided competition between the 2 men over a woman. But all Brian felt was relief. Profound, unmitigated relief that Sabrina, at least, had been smart enough to know they'd be making a huge mistake if they married. Then he met Nina's gaze again, and he felt something else, too. Something he'd never felt before, but he recognized nonetheless. Something his brother had ultimately found with Brian's ex-fiancée, something that had made him propose to Sabrina instead. Something that made Brian realize there was a lot more to life than work. Love, he said aloud. Sabrina didn't just meet up with my brother, Tristan. She fell in love with my brother, Tristan. Nina said nothing in response to that, only gazed at Brian in silence. She had to know. Though, he thought. Not only had he told her, but her hands were placed right over his heart. And the way his heart was racing now, as he looked back at her, feeling what he felt, knowing what he knew, she had to feel it. She had to. Finally, softly, she asked, "And how do you feel about that? That your brother, Tristan, is going to marry a woman you once planned to marry yourself?" "I'm happy," he told her. "Sabrina's a nice woman. I'm glad she finally found someone who allows her to realize that about herself." "And Tristan?" Nina asked. "Are you happy for him, too?" Brian recalled the last time he'd seen his brother, how desperate and terrified Tristan had been when he thought he'd lost Sabrina. Helping Tristan win her back was the first time he and his brother had worked together to gain something since. He smiled. Wow. That had probably been the first time in their lives they'd ever cooperated together by themselves to achieve a common goal. That it had been to enable one brother to win the heart of the woman who'd been engaged to the other. Well, that was actually pretty cool, now that Brian thought about it. Things between him and Tristan were better than they'd been in quite a few years, but they still weren't quite settled. Brian wasn't sure if he and his brother could ever go back to the glory days of college, the one period in their lives when they'd been as close as, well, brothers. But he was willing to put forth the effort if Tristan was. In addition to reuniting what was left of the Guidice family, burying the hatchet with Tristan would be nice. "I'm happy for Tristan, too," Brian said. "Really?" Nina asked. He nodded. "Really. He's a good guy, even if he's acted like a jerk over the last several years. I guess, in a way, he had his reasons." Of course, his reasons had been totally misguided, since he thought Brian had cheated him both years ago and as recently as a few months ago. Tristan and Sabrina both deserve to be happy, Brian said. He smiled at Nina. "Just like you and I deserve to be happy." "You should call him," Nina said. Brian nodded. "I will. I have a few things to talk to him about, not the least of which is to build a bridge that we should have built years ago." He met her gaze levelly now, wanting to gauge her reaction when he said the rest. "I also want to ask him about being best man at the wedding." "My wedding, I mean, not his." He held his breath as he added, "provided there's going to be my wedding in addition to his." She studied him in silence for a long time, her eyes never leaving his. He had no idea what she could be looking for, but she must have finally found it, because she smiled. Not a big smile, but it was enough to tell Brian that everything was going to be okay. He hoped. Finally, she said, "What do you mean your wedding? I assume there will be someone else at the altar, too, right?" "God, I hope so," he told her. "It wouldn't be much of a wedding without her." "It wouldn't be much of a marriage either," she pointed out. "Since, I assume you're taking into consideration that after the wedding ends, there will be a marriage hanging around your neck." He tilted his head to the side, feigning consideration. I don't know. I thought I might wear my marriage on my sleeve. Next to my heart." Now she rolled her eyes. "No one could ever accuse you of wearing your heart on your sleeve, Brian." "Maybe not before," he told her. "But I do now." She bent forward and craned her head to look first at his left arm, then at his right. "I don't see it anywhere." Catching her under her arms, he lifted her from the love seat and into his lap, then looped both arms around her waist. Oh, yeah, he thought. Everything was going to be just fine. "Sorry, my mistake," he said as he pulled her close. "My heart isn't on my arms. It's in them." She smiled at that, cupping her palm softly over his cheek. "What a coincidence," she said. "My heart is surrounding me." "So is my love," he told her. She smiled. "I love you, too." Very, very fine, he thought, relief and something even more wonderful coursing through him. "Enough to marry me?" he asked. "As long as it's not convenient," she replied. He brushed his lips over hers, once, twice, 3 times, 4, enough to get both their hearts pounding, but not enough to scramble their brains, at least not yet. Then he pressed his forehead to hers and pulled her closer still. "I think I can safely say there will be no convenience in our marriage," he told her. "Love, honor and cherishing, but no convenience." "Good," she said. "Because convenience just gets too messy sometimes." He sighed. "I must be absorbing the subtlety gene through osmosis," he said, "because I'm pretty sure you just told me you won't be running public relations conveniently either." "Oh, don't you worry your handsome little head about that," she told him. "I know what I'm doing. Trust me." He wasn't much surprised to discover that he did. He trusted Nina implicitly. And not just with the business either. Which meant he was so far gone on her, he was never coming back. All the more reason, he thought, to stay together forever. "I love you, Nina Jacobs." "I love you, Brian Guidice." "Then you'll marry me?" She nodded. "As long as you promise me you'll never let anyone program your smartphone but me." He chuckled and kissed her quickly on the lips. "It's a deal." The first deal he'd ever made that would enrich his personal life instead of his professional. 1. A very sweet deal indeed. Brian Guidice was a man who would be marrying his love. His life. The love of his life. Life was good, he thought as he dipped his head to Nina's again. And from here on out, it was only going to get better.
Epilogue. He could hear music blaring out of the office. A wild rendition of Jingle Bells. That was so like Nina. The bookstore was closed, but people were going in and out carrying boxes of food and presents to cars. As always, she headed up the drive to take dinners and gifts to the less fortunate, and she'd managed to rally quite a crew to help her. He couldn't wait to see her, to watch the way her eyes lit up when she first saw him, to see her smile blossom and hear her laughter. He ached to hold her, to feel her skin against his, and he could already taste her kiss. Sometimes, when he was away from her, he woke up with the taste of her in his mouth. He'd been gone 2 months this time. It was the longest they'd ever been apart, and he'd felt every second of the separation. He'd never stay away that long again. He needed his family far more than he needed the outlet of his work. He would still continue it, but he would not take a job where he would be separated from them for so long. He'd learned, in his long absence, that they were his balance and sanity. A part of him was afraid of his welcome. Afraid that smile, the light in Nina's eyes wouldn't be there for him this time. His hands gripped the steering wheel, thinking about losing her, losing what he had because he could never quite rid himself of the drive that drove him to work, endlessly. He heard laughter and turned his head to see the 2 little girls running up the street, clutching at Tristan's hands, dragging him toward the clinic. Their blonde hair, so like his, was shiny and bobbed as they ran. His 3-year-old twin daughters had Nina's deep brown eyes and her smile. He loved the sound of their laughter. He still couldn't believe he had daughters. Beautiful twins who climbed all over him and kissed him every chance they got. Nina had given him that gift. Observing Tristan with his daughters brought a lump to his throat. His relationship with his brother had grown into everything he'd hoped. He was tall and strong, and he carried himself with confidence. The shadows that had always been present in his eyes were replaced with contentment. He had friends, and he was extraordinarily happy with Sabrina. Nina had managed that as well. She'd drawn out the truth about Tristan and Sabrina's relationship, the realization that the espionage came, not from them, but from staff within the company, who had fed them both information from the mole inside Guidice games. The truth had allowed the brothers to set aside their lifelong enmity and work together to foil the plan which had, in fact, been set up by a third rival company, one that Michael Jones happened to have worked for. The operation had awakened a raw talent in Brian that he'd been determined to follow. He'd struck out on a new business venture, one which dealt with undercover espionage, tracing and arresting those responsible. Brian slid from the truck, knowing he was going to have to go in and face his fate. Unlike Tristan, he knew he would never be rid of the past. His relationship with his brother was built on a foundation of competition, and his financial empire was all that he'd known for so long, that he would grow restless after too long at home. He'd wake in the night, Nina in his arms, her voice soothing, her body soft and inviting, always ready to take away the fear that he would lose everything he'd worked so hard for. He loved her so much he ached with it, yet he couldn't always stay. No matter how hard he tried to hide it, Nina always saw the restlessness growing in him. It was always Nina who put her arms around him and told him to go. "It's okay," she would whisper, kissing her way up his back to the nape of his neck. "Do what you have to do and come back to us." She never cried, and she never chastised him or made him feel guilty. She was Nina, offering him freedom with love in her eyes, and he always returned because he couldn't live without her. But as he opened the door to the bookstore, his heart pounded with fear. If she rejected him, his life was over. He knew that, knew he needed her more than most men needed their wife and lover. She gave him acceptance and understanding when he didn't have it himself. She taught her daughters that same acceptance and understanding of his shortcomings, and she taught it to Tristan and Sabrina. The music greeted him as the door swung open. Someone bumped into him, laughed, and called out a Merry Christmas. He just kept walking through the outer office, down the decorated hall to the back room, where the operation of handing out boxes was taking place. Dread was growing, a dark, ugly feeling he couldn't stop. All around him were the signs of Christmas, of happiness overflowing. He walked with confidence, but deep inside, where no one saw, he was worried that this time, he'd been too engrossed with work, with corporate takeovers, to be welcomed back easily. "Daddy!" Tiffany screamed his name and rushed him, a small dynamo, throwing her arms around one leg, effectively stopping him. Jess cried out and followed her twin, twining her arms around the other leg. Brian reached down for them, his heart nearly bursting as he picked the girls up and settled them on his hips, kissing them over and over, but all the time his attention was on her. On Nina. He heard Tristan's greeting, felt his brother clap him on the back, and he returned the awkward hug. But it was Nina he watched, Nina he waited for. She turned slowly, as if she were afraid to believe it was true. Her gaze settled on his face. He held his breath. There it was. That slow smile of joy that lit up her eyes, brightened her face. Tears shimmered. The tears that were never there when he left but always there when he returned. "You're home." He handed the twins to Tristan. "I'm home." He gathered her into his arms and found her mouth with his. She fit close to him, her arms winding tightly around his neck, her mouth every bit as demanding as his. He tasted her sweetness. He tasted acceptance, desire. Most of all, he tasted love. He felt weak with joy, with relief. Nina was his rock, his foundation, his very life. "Get a room." Tristan and the twins chimed in together, something they did often around Nina and Brian. Nina laughed, resting her head on Brian's chest. "You made it home for Christmas. I'd never miss Christmas. Did you put up the tree already?" He held his breath again. It was silly to want to choose the tree, not when there were only 3 days left. "We never break tradition," Jen answered. "It wouldn't be the same without you." She smiled at him from the corner where she was packing more boxes, and he returned her grin. Sabrina wandered in at that moment, her arms full of packets of food. She was 6 months pregnant, and practically glowing as she made her way over to Tristan, dumping the food on the table on her way. She smiled at Brian as his brother pulled her into his arms, a gentle hand resting on her belly. When a young man wandered over to Jen and bent down to whisper in her ear, she nodded and smiled. "Who's that?" Brian asked Nina. his protective instincts kicking in at the possessiveness the man treated Jen with. She laughed and smacked his chest. "Be nice. That's Jeremy. I told you about him the last time we spoke. I don't like the look of him. He strikes me as up to no good." Nina just rolled her eyes and burrowed closer to him, her arms sliding around his waist. Brian looked at his brother over her head, and they smiled. They had a home, family, and they had love. Before Nina, as much as Jen had tried, the brothers had been unable to tolerate being in the same house together for long enough to celebrate Christmas. Not only that, their father had refused to celebrate, denying the children what they so badly longed for. As adults, they hadn't realized what they were missing until the day Nina and Sabrina entered their lives. Even Jen, who'd been as much of a workaholic as her brothers, was more relaxed now, able to enjoy the life that she'd built for herself as a successful psychologist with her own practice. Nina had worked with Brian for a year, helping his with various aspects of the business at Guidice Games, guiding both him and Tristan into working together. Her relationship with her sister had healed quickly, once they'd learned how Michael Jones had deceived both of them. When she'd found she was pregnant, a year and a half into their marriage, Nina renegotiated the terms of her partnership with her husband, deciding that she most definitely wanted to be a stay-at-home mother, at least until the twins were old enough to go to school. Looking around at his family, Brian acknowledged that as much as his work thrilled him, loving and being loved by the people closest to him was the greatest game he'd ever created. The end. If you want more BWWM romances like this, please, my love, be sure to subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel. I look forward to spending more time with you. Subscribe and let's make it happen.